Picture this: golden crowns glinting under torchlight, royal halls echoing with whispers, and rulers whose quirks were stranger than any fiction. Kings who thought they were made of glass, queens who ruled with poison, emperors undone by doorways. Tonight, we're not telling tales of wars or politics, but of the bizarre, hilarious, and hauntingly human stories that crowns can't hide. These aren't myths, they're true. And once you hear them, you'll never look at royalty the same way again. Welcome to 101 Strangest Royal Street Stories That Were Totally True. Before we dive in, a quick favour. If you love strange history as much as I do, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next descent into royal absurdity. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? I'm always curious who's out there wandering through these stories with me. King Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass. Imagine a king so fragile he wouldn't let you touch him. Not because of politics, not because of royal etiquette, but because he thought your hand might shatter him into 1,000 little pieces. King Charles VI of France, the man who ruled one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, truly believed he was made of glass, not metaphorically fragile, not poetically delicate, literally glass. He padded his clothes with layers of cloth to prevent accidental breakage and lived in constant fear of shattering. Courtiers whispered, amused and horrified, that their monarch was simultaneously the most powerful man in France and also the most brittle. The irony is delicious. A ruler whose word could end wars, reduced to paranoia over bumping into a table. While his people dealt with famine, disease, and war, Charles was busy testing chairs for their glass safety rating. What's more unsettling is how earnestly he lived this belief. The human mind, when caught in its own illusions, is more convincing than any court magician. Doctors at the time tried their tricks, bloodletting, prayers, even exorcisms. Nothing worked. And in the end, France was left with a king terrified of his own fragility. It's tempting to laugh at him, but then you wonder, how many of us live in a similar illusion, carrying fears that exist only in our heads, padded in metaphorical cloth, terrified of shattering in a world that's already broken? But France wasn't the only country where kings wandered into surreal landscapes of the mind. England had its own monarch who spoke to beings that weren't there, and sometimes to things that definitely weren't human. King George III of England talked to trees. King George III, remembered in school textbooks as the king who lost America, but rarely remembered as the king who chatted with oak trees. Yes, he held conversations with them as if they were old drinking companions. Not political metaphors, not private prayers, actual tree talk. Imagine wandering through Windsor Great Park and stumbling across your monarch negotiating foreign policy with an oak branch. To George, the trees weren't mute, they were confidants, witnesses, perhaps, to his mind, more trustworthy than his ministers. After all, the trees didn't gossip. The trees didn't betray him, they simply stood still and listened, which, come to think of it, is more than you can say for most politicians. Historians argue whether this was a symptom of his bouts of mental illness, or whether the king had stumbled into some eccentric communion with nature. But if madness is talking to trees, then sanity might just be overrated. After all, don't we all talk to something that doesn't answer back? Pets, dead relatives, our reflection in the mirror? George just elevated it to royal policy. Doctors, again, tried everything. Isolation, herbal remedies, harsh regimens that would break a healthy man. But the conversations continued. The monarch, surrounded by luxury, was most at ease with roots, bark, and leaves. And perhaps the biggest irony is this. He was seen as mad for speaking to trees, yet his ministers, who casually oversaw wars and economic disasters, were considered perfectly sane. But George's eccentric chats pale in comparison to a Roman emperor who decided history itself was a stage and who never met a competition he couldn't rig in his favor. Strange, isn't it, how a single royal obsession can reshape an entire empire? And trust me, we're only scratching the surface. If you're enjoying this dive into royal eccentricities, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the stories. And while you're here, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? I love seeing the mix of places and hours this channel reaches. Emperor Nero of Rome at the Olympics. Picture the most infamous emperor of Rome strapping on a competitor's tunic and declaring himself an Olympic athlete. Nero didn't just dabble in politics, he insisted on starring in every event he entered. The catch? He wasn't exactly athletic. He entered chariot races, music contests, poetry recitals, and in every case, shockingly, emerged the winner. The judges knew what was at stake. Denying the emperor victory was a short career move. So, when Nero fell off his chariot mid-race, bloodied and humiliated, the crowd already knew the outcome. Victory, of course. Nero declared it himself. This wasn't sport. This was theatre. The Olympics, one of humanity's purest tests of physical excellence, turned into a one-man vanity project. And the Roman audience? They played along because survival demanded applause. The emperor demanded a gold medal, and so he got one. The tragedy is that Nero might actually have believed he was worthy. Surrounded by sycophants, drowned in false cheers, he mistook forced celebration for genuine glory. Which is, ironically, the same trap that powerful people still fall into today. Call it the tyranny of the standing ovation. But Rome's mad emperor wasn't alone in his excesses. Across the sea, a queen who commanded an empire chose to build her identity in a very different way, not in bloodied arenas, but in silk, lace, and an absurd number of dresses. And some wigs that probably smelled worse than the gladiator pits. Queen Elizabeth I and her 3,000 dresses. There's power in repetition. Some rulers built pyramids, others staged Olympic fiascos, but Queen Elizabeth I of England built her authority stitch by stitch, dress by dress. Reports say she owned more than 3,000 gowns, each one a weaponized piece of theatre. A dazzling dress wasn't just clothing, it was propaganda you could wear. She was the Virgin Queen, but also the Queen of Wardrobe Changes. And yet, beneath the finery, the wigs. Oh, the wigs. Court whispers said Elizabeth wore them well past their prime. Stringy, sometimes dirty, but still paraded as symbols of majesty. It's a sharp irony. A monarch whose empire was expanding across the seas, whose navy defeated the Spanish Armada, might still have been walking around in a suspiciously musty hairpiece. This wasn't just vanity, it was survival. Elizabeth lived in a world where appearance was power, where being underestimated meant being dethroned. A dirty wig could still crown an untouchable queen. For her, the illusion mattered more than the material. The dresses became armor not against swords, but against doubt. Think about it. 3,000 gowns, each designed to project stability in a kingdom, constantly teetering between religious chaos and foreign threat. Every jeweled hem whispered, "Don't mess with me." But the wigs, they reveal the flaw in every illusion. Majesty always has a crack in the foundation. And if Elizabeth used her wardrobe to project power, her successor in the mystery queue used something far stranger. A printed manifesto about witches, weather, and the devil's control of storms. King James VI of Scotland and the Witches. Long before conspiracy podcasts, there was King James VI of Scotland, a monarch who didn't just dabble in witch hunting, he literally wrote the book on it. His treatise, Daemonology, argued that witches were real, that they flew through the skies, whispered to the devil, and even stirred up tempests to sink ships. For James, storms weren't natural, they were sabotage. The irony is almost comical. A king with absolute power, commanding armies and shaping nations, terrified that the weather might be run by angry women in league with Satan. Yet he believed it so deeply he set witch trials in motion, sending countless ordinary people to their doom on the strength of paranoia dressed as scholarship. James wasn't a fool in the conventional sense. He was intelligent, even scholarly. But his obsession shows how intelligence bends under fear. When storms rocked his marriage voyage, he blamed not chance, not the sea, but witches. Nature itself was criminalized. He even interrogated suspected witches personally, the king as prosecutor, judge, and paranoid philosopher. Historians like to frame this as superstition, but isn't it just a more dramatic version of what leaders still do today? Blame unseen enemies for their misfortunes, write it down as policy, and call it truth. James left behind a crown and a book, and only one of those has aged into dark comedy. And if you think a royal obsession with witches was absurd, just wait. The next monarch on our list outsourced his most private duties to a man with a very particular, very undignified job description: King Henry VIII and the Groom of the Stool. Now, kings have always had attendants, advisors, scribes, bodyguards. But King Henry VIII of England had a servant whose title still raises eyebrows: the Groom of the Stool. Yes, stool as in exactly what you're imagining. The man's entire role was to assist the king in his most private moments, to attend to matters that polite society pretends do not exist. This wasn't seen as degrading. Quite the opposite, it was one of the most prestigious positions at court. Why? Because no one had more access to the king. In those quiet, unguarded moments, the groom heard secrets, complaints, fears. It was an intimacy more powerful than any minister could dream of. Henry's paranoia may have kept his courtiers at bay, but his Groom of the Stool, he was indispensable. The role also symbolized something very telling about monarchy itself: the blending of absolute majesty with absolute humanity. A man who ordered executions, broke with the Catholic Church, and married 6 times still required help in the bathroom. Power looks invincible on paper. In practice, it sits on a throne of porcelain. Henry's reign is remembered for its violence, its wives, its break with Rome. But this strange job, this bizarrely prestigious position, is the detail that reveals the contradiction of kingship. You can rule the realm, but you can't escape the realities of the body. And yet, if Henry VIII brought his bodily needs into the spotlight, the queen who followed in our next tale turned her obsession outward, not toward politics, not toward war, but toward the slow and silent growth of acorns. Queen Victoria and her acorns. For most monarchs, the markers of legacy are things like palaces, wars, and political upheavals. For Queen Victoria, however, a quieter obsession rooted itself in her gardens. Trees. Not just grand, towering oaks that had stood for centuries, but tiny acorns. She had her servants plant them in the soil around her estates so that she could, quite literally, watch the passage of time grow before her eyes. It sounds quaint, almost whimsical. The ruler of an empire where the sun famously never set, bending down to fuss over an acorn. Yet beneath that charming image lies something more telling. Victoria's reign was an age of speed. industrial revolutions, railroads, telegraphs, factories. And while her empire thundered forward on iron wheels, she seemed to crave the opposite, slow time. The time of acorns and roots. Her love of trees was so pronounced that even in her diaries she returned to them again and again. She assigned them character. She watched them like family members, and she seemed to find in their growth a strange permanence that her tumultuous court could never provide. After all, an acorn planted today would long outlive even the longest reign. Perhaps it was her way of leaving a personal legacy, one that no scandal or political squabble could uproot. But of course, even Victoria's arboreal affection pales when compared to the spectacle of another monarch who took obsession with appearances to a theatrical extreme. Not acorns, not small growth, but endless wigs and layers of clothes designed to outshine the very Sunday. King Louis XIV and his 1,000 wigs. Louis XIV didn't just sit on the throne of France, he turned himself into a living solar system, with every planet revolving around him. They called him the Sun King, and he embraced the title with a passion for grandeur that bordered on parody. His Versailles court was a theatre, and Louis was both director and star. His wigs, over 1,000 of them, each one a different version of royal gravity. The wigs were not simply fashion. They were instruments of power. They added height, majesty, and more importantly, distance between Louis and mere mortals. The elaborate coiffures became a symbol. The bigger the wig, the bigger the man beneath it. And Louis wore them relentlessly. Then there were the clothes. Up to 5 layers of embroidered finery, even in the sweltering summer heat. Sweat was the price of spectacle. He paraded himself through corridors like a walking monument, making sure every stitch, every hair, projected power. Meanwhile, courtiers imitated him desperately, spending fortunes on wigs and fabric just to keep up. Versailles became less a palace than a costume competition. And yet, behind the theatrical brilliance lay a different truth. The wigs hid thinning hair. The layers of clothing shielded vulnerability, and the endless ritual of appearance masked insecurity. The king who called himself the sun still feared the shadow of irrelevance. But if Louis staged his rule with wigs and silks, a Roman emperor went much further. He waged war not against nations, but against the sea itself, commanding soldiers to fight waves and collect seashells as if they were trophies of conquest. Emperor Caligula declares war on the sea. Caligula. The name alone is shorthand for excess, madness, and absurdity. And among his strangest moments stands one unforgettable campaign, his war against the ocean. Marching his troops to the shores of Gaul, he ordered them to attack the waves. Then, in a moment that veered from comedy to tragedy, he commanded the soldiers to gather seashells as the spoils of war. The scene reads like satire. Hardened legionaries, veterans of brutal campaigns, bent over in the surf collecting shells for their emperor's treasure chest. Was it a joke? A humiliation ritual? Or the desperate act of a ruler unraveling under the weight of absolute power? No one can say for certain. Caligula framed it as a triumph. He even built a triumphal arch to commemorate the victory. The ocean had been defeated, and seashells paraded as proof. The contradiction is irresistible. A man who commanded the greatest army on earth, reduced to conquering tides. A ruler who could have reshaped nations, instead declaring himself master of seashells. Historians debate whether Caligula was insane, sarcastic, or simply cruel. But perhaps the deeper point is this. When power reaches its extreme, it no longer seeks purpose. It seeks performance. And the audience, in this case, the terrified soldiers, had no choice but to applaud. Yet if Caligula dramatized conquest by making war on water, another royal chose to dramatize escape. A queen who shocked Europe not by what she built or whom she fought, but by abandoning her throne altogether and living disguised as a man. Queen Christina of Sweden, disguised as a man. Imagine being crowned Queen of Sweden in the 1602nd, only to shrug at the crown, toss aside the throne, and vanish into the world disguised as a man. That was Christina of Sweden, a monarch so unusual she baffled contemporaries and continues to perplex historians. She inherited the throne as a teenager, and for a while played the part expected of her. Regal, commanding, a figure of national pride. But Christina was never interested in convention. Instead of marriage alliances and political scheming, she obsessed over philosophy, art, and theatre. She built one of the most dazzling intellectual courts in Europe, hosting thinkers and musicians like they were rock stars. But in the midst of this cultural brilliance, she was quietly plotting her escape. Christina hated the idea of marriage and succession politics. She hated being trapped in a role defined by ceremony. And so, in 1654, she shocked Europe. She abdicated. Dressed as a man, she rode south through Europe, abandoning her kingdom for a life of travel, reinvention, and sometimes scandal. She converted to Catholicism, dined with popes, and lived as a perpetual outsider, too eccentric for her homeland, too unruly for Rome, too independent for any court. The disguise was less about trickery and more about freedom. Christina lived as a riddle, queen, philosopher, traveller, wanderer. In the end, Christina's story isn't just about leaving a throne. It's about rejecting the very script of monarchy itself. While most rulers clung to power desperately, she walked away from it, trading crowns for costumes. But eccentric as she was, her escape is tame compared to another king, one who let his palace descend into a zoo, with monkeys and parrots ruling the halls. King Charles II of England and his menagerie. Restoration England expected its king to rebuild institutions, restore confidence, and stabilize a shaky monarchy. What it got instead was King Charles II, a man who preferred to fill his palace with animals. Parrots, cats, and monkeys roamed freely through the corridors of Whitehall, delighting some courtiers and terrifying others. Charles was called the Merry Monarch for his charisma and wit, but he was also a master of distraction. The kingdom was still recovering from civil war and regicide, yet his court looked more like a carnival than a government. Picture ambassadors nervously dodging a monkey swinging from the rafters while trying to negotiate trade deals. The animals weren't just pets, they symbolized the king himself. Unpredictable, mischievous, sometimes endearing, often chaotic. Charles loved breaking formality, turning the rigid palace into a place of spectacle. He also enjoyed showing off exotic creatures as proof of England's growing global reach. Monkeys from faraway colonies, parrots from tropical lands, all displayed like living trophies of empire. But here's the twist. Charles's menagerie revealed something deeper about monarchy. Beneath the wigs and rituals, rulers are drawn to spectacle, to entertainment, to anything that makes them appear larger than life. A king surrounded by animals was both absurd and strangely fitting a reminder that the court itself was little more than a zoo, with humans performing their own ridiculous rituals of hierarchy. And yet, if Charles turned his palace into a circus, another queen took things further. She built an entire fake village where she could pretend to be a milkmaid, playing peasant dress-up while her real peasants struggled to survive. Queen Marie Antoinette and her make-believe village. Marie Antoinette, the name already drips with decadence, scandal, and downfall. But among her many eccentricities, perhaps none was stranger than the little village she had built at Versailles, the Hameau de la Reine. It looked like a rustic hamlet, complete with cottages, a dairy, and gardens. But this was no real peasant village. It was a stage set designed for the Queen to escape court life and play at being a milkmaid. Dressed in simple gowns, Marie and her friends would frolic in the gardens, tending cows and sheep that were scrubbed clean before each royal performance. The cottages looked humble, but inside they were furnished luxuriously velvet curtains, fine china, the works. The peasants of France, meanwhile, lived in genuine squalor, barely scraping by. The irony was grotesque, a queen pretending at poverty while her people endured the real thing. To her, the village was a sanctuary, a place to breathe, to imagine herself as ordinary, to flee the suffocating rituals of Versailles. But perception is everything, and her fantasy only deepened resentment. To critics, it proved she was out of touch, cosplaying hardship while ignoring reality. It's easy to sneer at her play acting, but isn't there something hauntingly modern about it? A powerful figure escaping into a curated fantasy while the world outside grows harsher by the day? Marie's little hamlet wasn't just a playground, it was a metaphor for monarchy itself. Beautiful facades, carefully maintained illusions, and a stubborn refusal to face the storm. But if Marie retreated into a stage village, another ruler sought his thrills in a darker pastime, pulling teeth, sometimes from willing subjects, sometimes from anyone unlucky enough to be nearby. Tsar Peter the Great and his tooth collection. When you think of Peter the Great, you might picture towering reforms, naval fleets, and the modernization of Russia. What you might not picture is Peter hunched over, gleefully extracting teeth from anyone he could persuade or force into his chair. He wasn't a dentist, though he fancied himself one. He was a collector, a hobbyist, with a strange fixation. And he believed, in his own way, that pulling teeth made him closer to understanding the human body, and thus, in his mind, the human soul. Peter's court lived in a state of constant alert, because one never knew when the Tsar's curiosity would strike. He carried pliers with him, ready at all times. Sometimes he would pull diseased teeth, other times perfectly healthy ones. Afterward, he added them to a collection that grew into a grim sort of museum. Visitors were shown not just ships and palaces, but rows upon rows of teeth, labelled and displayed. There's something unsettling here. A ruler shaping the destiny of a vast empire was also obsessed with a detail so small, so personal, that it bordered on absurd. But it also fits a pattern. Absolute power seeks absolute intimacy. For Peter, modernizing Russia wasn't enough. He wanted to get under the skin, literally. It leaves you wondering, were his reforms about building a stronger state, or about proving he could remake everything, from ships to smiles, by his own hand? Either way, his obsession places him firmly among history's strangest rulers. But compared to the emperor who built a palace of oddities filled with automata, exotic creatures, and so-called magical wonders, Peter's teeth seem almost tame. Emperor Rudolph II and his Palace of Curiosities. If Peter the Great wanted to understand the body, Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire wanted to understand everything else. His Prague palace became less a royal residence and more a cabinet of wonders exploded to palace scale. Exotic animals wandered the halls, mechanical clocks ticked in endless varieties. Astronomical instruments clattered and spun. His collection was a labyrinth of marvels and absurdities, half museum, half magician's den. Rudolph was fascinated by the strange and the unexplainable. Alchemists thrived under his patronage, convinced they might finally turn lead into gold. Astrologers charted the stars for him, blending science with mysticism. Scholars from across Europe visited, not to bow before him, but to marvel at the treasure trove of oddities he had amassed. And yet, while he surrounded himself with curiosities, his empire fell into chaos. He became increasingly withdrawn, more focused on his collections than on governance. The palace filled with wonders, while the realm outside filled with unrest. His menagerie was a mirror of his rule, beautiful, bizarre, and utterly impractical. What does it say about monarchy when the ruler of a sprawling empire invests more energy in wind-up birds and exotic beasts than in politics? Maybe it says the same thing it always says. Power isolates, and isolation breeds obsession. But Rudolph's Zoo of Curiosities has nothing on the Sun King's successor, Louis XV, who decided to keep his own animals not locked away in cabinets, but parading through the gardens of Versailles, King Louis XV, and his zoo at Versailles. If Louis XIV was the Sun King, his successor Louis XV could have been the Zoo King. At Versailles, where symmetry and control defined every fountain and hedge, Louis introduced a new form of spectacle: animals. Elephants, lions, antelopes, even rare birds were placed in enclosures scattered around the manicured gardens. Visitors expecting to be dazzled by fountains and gilded halls found themselves face to face with creatures usually reserved for distant jungles. For Louis, the zoo was a demonstration of empire. Exotic beasts showed that France could reach across the world and bring back living trophies. The animals became living proof of colonial reach and royal extravagance. But there was also something childlike in his fascination. Reports suggest he took genuine pleasure in feeding and watching them. His elephants, in particular, became Versailles celebrities, wandering the grounds in surreal contrast to the rigid symmetry of French garden design. The irony is thick. Versailles, a symbol of order, rational design, and absolute monarchy, was populated with uncontrollable beasts. The zoo mirrored this state itself, glamorous, spectacular, but unpredictable and dangerous at its core. Some historians see Louis' zoo as frivolity. Others see it as a deliberate attempt to show power through spectacle. Either way, the result was the same. Versailles became not just a palace, but a stage where animals and courtiers alike performed for the king. But Louis's menagerie of lions and elephants pales next to the empress who imported shiploads of fruit she didn't even like just to flood her court with citrus, Catherine the Great and her oranges. Catherine the Great of Russia had a habit that left her courtiers bewildered. She imported endless crates of lemons and oranges into her palaces. This might sound like a personal indulgence, but here's the twist: she didn't actually like the taste. The fruit wasn't for eating, it was for showing. Piles of citrus became displays, bright decorations scattered across tables and halls. Symbols of wealth and sophistication in a country where such fruits were practically alien. Russia in the 18th century was not exactly hospitable to Mediterranean orchards. To bring in oranges required networks of trade, careful shipping, and, of course, immense expense. To Catherine, that was the point. She wasn't interested in consuming the fruit so much as consuming the spectacle of possessing it. Every gleaming orange was a sign that Russia under her rule could rival the luxuries of France or Italy. Guests at court were dazzled by the abundance. The fruit wasn't merely food, it was a visual feast, a quiet announcement of Russia's growing power. Even so, the irony lingered. Catherine amassed treasures she didn't care for, just to remind others she could. Luxury without desire. Wealth without appetite. It's almost poetic that her empire, sprawling and hungry for reform, was peppered with decorations that no one ate. A nation of millions reduced to citrus centerpieces. And if Catherine flaunted her power with fruit, one of her imperial predecessors took extravagance in another direction entirely by letting a horse join him at the dining table. Emperor Hadrian and his horse at the table. Roman emperors had a flair for eccentricity, and Hadrian was no exception. Though best remembered for his Great Wall in Britain and his architectural projects, he also had a softer, stranger side: his affection for his horse. Unlike most rulers who saw animals as tools for battle or transport, Hadrian elevated his favourite steed to the level of honoured guest. The horse dined at the palace table. Imagine the scene. Senators and generals seated stiffly in togas, and there, among them, a horse calmly chewing its feed. Was this affection? A joke? A symbol? Perhaps all of the above. To Hadrian, the animal was more than a beast of burden. It was a companion, one worthy of comfort and ceremony. The Romans, practical as they were, must have raised eyebrows. They admired strength in animals, but didn't typically serve them banquets. Hadrian broke that rule. By dining with his horse, he blurred the line between man and beast, elevating loyalty over decorum. Some historians suggest this reflected his philosophical interests, that he was making a quiet statement about the worth of all creatures, or maybe he just really liked his horse. Either way, the image stuck. A mighty emperor surrounded by marble and splendor, yet unwilling to eat without his four-legged friend nearby. But Hadrian's gesture of companionship looks almost humble compared to a later monarch who didn't just share his tastes with his court, he forced everyone to copy his style down to the very thread. King Charles XI of Sweden and his grey uniforms. In 17th century Sweden, Charles XI decided fashion wasn't a matter of personal choice. It was monarchy's business. And so, he issued one of the strangest style edicts in royal history. His entire court was required to dress exactly like him. His choice of outfit? A plain, grey suit. Gone were the silks, the colours, the flamboyant displays that usually defined European courts. In their place, rows of courtiers looking like an assembly line of Charles clones. It was uniformity elevated to spectacle. Imagine banquets where everyone looked like mirror images of the king. A sea of identical grey. Why did he do it? Some argue thrift. Sweden wasn't the richest kingdom, and Charles despised waste. By forcing simplicity, he eliminated extravagance. Others suggest control. By stripping courtiers of individuality, he reduced their ability to outshine him. No rival fashion, no competing brilliance, only the king's chosen palette. The result was eerie. Foreign visitors found the court austere, almost monastic. The pomp of royalty was replaced by a strange conformity. Yet in that uniformity, Charles found power. He turned himself into the sole point of focus, the only figure who mattered amid a blur of grey. The irony is sharp. By denying extravagance, he created a spectacle all the same. Sweden's court became memorable not for opulence, but for its stark absence of it. And while Charles XI made his courtiers dress like clones, one queen centuries later found subtler ways to control her court, with a code hidden in something as simple as the position of her handbag. Queen Elizabeth II and her handbag code. Modern monarchs rarely make it into lists of eccentricity. By the 20th century, royalty had become more restrained, more carefully managed by press offices and public relations. But Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch of Britain, carried with her a secret language hidden in plain sight: the handbag code. The handbag was never just an accessory, it was a subtle tool of command. When she shifted it from one arm to another, it meant she was ready to end a conversation. If she placed it on the floor, it signaled to her staff that she needed rescuing. If she set it firmly on the table, it was time to wrap things up, all without uttering a word. Imagine being a diplomat or dignitary, nervously watching the Queen's handbag as though it were a royal oracle. Was she bored? Was she amused? Was she silently begging an aid to save her from your speech about agricultural reform? The handbag became less a fashion statement and more a scepter in leather form. It's a reminder that monarchy survives not by pomp alone, but by subtle control of image and interaction. Elizabeth didn't need to storm out of a room or insult anyone to show impatience. She simply tilted her handbag, and centuries of courtly choreography kicked into action. And perhaps that's the strangest thing. In an era of instant communication, the Queen still relied on coded gestures, turning etiquette into quiet strategy. But where Elizabeth whispered her commands through handbags, another king before her shouted his vision through stone and castles, fairy tale creations so extravagant they bankrupted him. King Ludwig II of Bavaria and his fairy tale castles. King Ludwig II of Bavaria is often called the Mad King, though in truth he may have simply been an artist born into the wrong profession. His obsession was beauty, specifically, building castles so extravagant, so dreamlike, that they looked as if they had been plucked from opera stages or fairy tales. Inspired by the music of Richard Wagner, Ludwig poured fortunes into construction projects that seemed more like hallucinations than architecture. Neuschwanstein Castle, with its soaring towers and dramatic cliffs, looks today like something Disney might have invented, but Ludwig built it centuries before theme parks. To him, these castles were not merely residencies. They were visions, sanctuaries, places where he could escape the grinding machinery of politics and live in a world of myth and music. The problem, of course, was cost. Bavaria could not sustain the king's imagination. As the castles rose, so did his debts. Ministers grumbled, foreign observers mocked him. His people wondered if their king had lost his grip on reality. But Ludwig didn't care. He built for himself, not for them. It is deeply ironic that the king who bankrupted himself building castles is now remembered almost entirely for them. What once seemed like madness is today celebrated as genius tourism marketing. Millions flock to Bavaria to admire the dreamscapes Ludwig left behind. His ruin became Bavaria's treasure. But if Ludwig crafted fantasies in stone, another ruler's obsession was not with walls or towers, but with words. Thousands of them, shelved in endless rows that turned his palace into one of the greatest libraries in history. Caliph Al-Hakam II and his endless library. In Cordoba during the 10th century, Caliph Al-Hakam II amassed a library so vast it seemed almost mythical. Reports claim it held more than 400,000 books, a staggering number in an age when every manuscript had to be copied by hand. His collection dwarfed anything Europe possessed at the time. For Al-Hakam, knowledge itself was the ultimate treasure. He didn't just hoard books, he read obsessively. Scholars from across the Islamic world sent works to Cordoba, where scribes carefully reproduced and catalogued them. Philosophy, science, poetry, medicine all found a home in his labyrinth of shelves. To walk through that library must have been like walking through a condensed version of human thought. And yet, as with so many royal obsessions, there was irony. The caliph who gathered knowledge so voraciously left behind little political stability. His empire would fracture soon after his death. The books remained, but the kingdom around them crumbled. It's as if his passion for ideas consumed more of his energy than ruling did. Still, his library became legend. For a time, Cordoba was the intellectual capital of Europe, a place where Christian monks and Muslim scholars alike came to learn. The wealth of the caliph was not displayed in jewels or elephants, but in ink and parchment. It leaves us with a strange paradox. The ruler who treasured permanence built something as fragile as paper, shelves upon shelves of delicate manuscripts that could vanish in a single fire. And yet, what's more lasting, a jeweled crown or an idea pressed into words? But while Al-Hakam preserved his empire through pages, his successor would show the opposite impulse, tearing down an entire palace simply because he didn't like the view. Caliph al-Mansur and the Moved Palace. Some rulers expand their palaces, others decorate them. Caliph al-Mansur of the Abbasid dynasty decided to dismantle his palace altogether and rebuild it a little farther away. Not because it was falling apart, not because of military necessity, but because he didn't like the view. Imagine the power of that whim. Disassemble an architectural marvel, haul the materials stone by stone, and reconstruct the whole thing because the sightlines weren't quite perfect. It sounds absurd, but it reveals something profound about absolute rule. For most people, a bad view means rearranging the furniture or maybe planting a few trees. For al-Mansur, it meant rewriting the landscape itself. His personal dissatisfaction could mobilize entire workforces. In a world where most people had no control over their own homes, the Caliph could move palaces like chess pieces. The irony is rich. Al-Mansur is remembered as one of the great founders of Baghdad, the man who laid the foundation of a city that would become a jewel of the Islamic world. Yet beneath the grand vision there was also pettiness. A ruler so sensitive to aesthetics that his power allowed him to treat monumental architecture like a child might treat building blocks. In the end, the moved palace serves as both a metaphor and a warning. When comfort becomes limitless, it mutates into obsession. And Mansur's dissatisfaction looks almost quaint compared to another ruler of his empire, a sultan who hurled wealth into the sea just to watch poor fishermen scramble after it. Sultan Ibrahim I and the Gold in the Sea. Known in Ottoman history as Ibrahim the Mad, Sultan Ibrahim I had a streak of unpredictability that unsettled his court. Among his many strange habits, one stands out. Throwing gold coins into the Bosporus, then watching gleefully as desperate fishermen dove after them. On one level, it was entertainment, a royal pastime of chaos, mixing spectacle with cruelty. On another, it was a raw display of power. The act reduced precious currency into mere trinkets, reminding everyone that the Sultan's whims outweighed the value of money itself. For the fishermen, the coins were survival. For Ibrahim, they were toys. The scene must have been surreal. Shimmering coins raining into the sea, men splashing and diving as the Sultan laughed from the shore. A monarch turning economic lifeblood into performance art. Was it sadism? Was it boredom? Was it simply the loneliness of supreme power expressed through absurd games? Historians still debate. Whatever his motivation, the act symbolized a dangerous disconnect between ruler and ruled. To Ibrahim, the sea was an endless stage. To his people, it was labor, sustenance, life. And when a ruler treats the necessities of life as props, disaster is never far away. But if Ibrahim's eccentricity was throwing wealth into water, another caliph took the opposite approach, slipping away into the streets at night, disguising himself as an ordinary man, and blending into the crowd. Caliph Harun al-Rashid in disguise. Harun al-Rashid, the most famous caliph of the Abbasid dynasty, is remembered in legend not just as a ruler, but as a character in the tales of 1001 Nights. One reason for his mythic aura was his habit of disguising himself and wandering the streets of Baghdad at night. Unlike the pomp of his court, Harun's nighttime excursions were intimate, even risky. He dressed as a commoner, blending into the bustling markets, listening to gossip, and observing his subjects without the filter of courtiers or advisors. Some stories claim he used these outings to administer justice personally, correcting wrongs or rewarding loyalty on the spot. Others suggest he simply craved freedom, the rare chance to exist outside the suffocating rituals of monarchy. There's something both admirable and ironic about this. Admirable because Harun wanted to see his people as they truly lived. Ironic because the very need to disguise himself underscores how cut off he was from ordinary life. He had to become someone else to glimpse reality. Over time, these wanderings took on a legendary quality. In popular imagination, Harun became less a ruler and more a folkloric figure, a king who walked among his people unseen. Fact and myth blurred together, as they so often do in royal stories. And yet, for all Harun's desire to experience life incognito, his descendant Sultan Mehmed IV went the opposite direction, loudly proclaiming his obsession for all to see, to the point where state business often had to wait while he pursued his favorite pastime, the hunt. Sultan Mehmed IV and his endless hunts. Every ruler has their distraction. Some choose books, others palaces, others wigs. Sultan Mehmed IV of the Ottoman Empire chose the hunt. Deer, boar, birds, it didn't matter what. The thrill of the chase consumed him so completely that his reign earned him the nickname, the Hunter. To Mehmed, hunting wasn't just a hobby. It was a full-time occupation. He spent weeks at a time away from court, roaming the countryside with his entourage, chasing game while matters of state piled up back in Istanbul. Ministers fumed, ambassadors waited, petitions went unanswered, because the Sultan had spotted another stag. The spectacle of Mehmed's hunts was staggering. Hundreds of men, horses, dogs, and falcons followed him, turning the wilderness into a moving carnival. What began as leisure became obsession, until even crucial decisions of empire were delayed or delegated. For the common people, the message was clear. Their Sultan cared more about trophies than treaties. And yet, there is something revealing in this fixation. Perhaps Mehmed found in the hunt what he couldn't find in politics. A clear pursuit, a visible goal, a challenge that could be met with skill rather than intrigue. In the forest, the prey either escaped or fell. There were no deceptive courtiers, no endless negotiations, just speed, instinct, and victory. Still, history tends to remember not the clarity of his hunts, but the chaos his absence caused. A ruler who traded governance for game may have found freedom in the chase, but his empire paid the price. And if Mehmed chased deer through the forests, another ruler, one far more famous, sought luxury, not in animals or sport, but in milk baths, believing they preserved her beauty. Cleopatra and the donkey's milk baths. Few royal figures loom as large in legend as Cleopatra of Egypt. She has been immortalized as a seductress, a strategist, a queen who matched wits with Rome itself. But beneath all the grandeur lies one of her most peculiar habits, bathing in donkey's milk. The story goes that Cleopatra believed these baths preserved her skin's youth and radiance. Every day, hundreds of donkeys were milked to fill her tubs, creating an ocean of frothy whiteness in which the queen would recline. Whether or not it actually improved her skin, the symbolism was undeniable. Only Cleopatra could command such extravagance. There's an irony to the ritual. Egypt was a land where water itself was sacred, where survival depended on the Nile's yearly floods. And yet here was its queen bathing not in water, but in milk, a substance that could have fed countless mouths. It was beauty as theatre, self-care turned spectacle. Did Cleopatra truly believe in the milk's powers, or was it just another way to project otherworldly glamour? Historians debate. But even if it was superstition, it worked. Her image endures not just as a ruler, but as a living myth. Every bath was an act of self-mythology, a way of stepping out of the ordinary and into legend. Still, for all its extravagance, Cleopatra's ritual seems almost refined when compared to the fate of an Ottoman sultan centuries later, who indulged a little too heavily in drink and met an undignified end because of it. Sultan Selim II and the fatal fall. Sultan Selim II of the Ottoman Empire, nicknamed Selim the Sot, is remembered less for his conquests and more for his indulgences. Unlike his warrior ancestors, Selim preferred the comforts of the palace: music, poetry, and, most notoriously, wine. His favorite variety was made from pomegranates, a sweet indulgence that became almost synonymous with his reign. But indulgence carries risks. One evening, after partaking too freely, Selim stumbled and fell, striking his head. The injury proved fatal. Thus ended the reign of an Ottoman sultan, not on the battlefield, not in a grand palace coup, but in a moment of clumsy overindulgence. The story is almost Shakespearean in its irony. A dynasty built on military might, naval power, and imperial ambition was, for a moment, reduced to fragility by a single slip. Selim's fall became a cautionary tale about excess, a reminder that empires may stand tall, but their rulers are still vulnerable to the simplest missteps. Historians have long debated whether Selim's death was truly as described or whether the story was exaggerated to highlight his reputation for indulgence. Either way, the tale endures because it fits so perfectly into the narrative of his life. A man undone, not by enemies, but by his appetites. And so the irony continues. A mighty empire shaken not by war, but by a stumble. Yet if Selim's downfall was born of indulgence, the next caliph on our list reveals a different kind of extravagance, one rooted not in drink, but in shoes. Caliph al-Mu'taz and his endless shoes. There are rulers who hoard treasure, rulers who build monuments, and rulers who obsess over fashion. Caliph al-Mu'taz of the Abbasid dynasty fell into that last category, and he carried it to an almost cartoonish extreme. According to chroniclers, he demanded a new pair of shoes every single day, and the previous day's pair was simply discarded. No reuse, no recycling, no sentimental attachment. Just one and done footwear. Imagine the logistics. Day after day, craftsmen working to produce ornate slippers, leather sandals, embroidered boots, all destined for a single outing. The caliph's shoe closet must have resembled a market stall multiplied by infinity. For most people, a pair of shoes was a precious commodity, repaired and patched for years. For al-Mu'taz, they were disposable props in the theatre of monarchy. This habit was more than indulgence, it was performance. Every fresh pair was a reminder to courtiers and visitors alike. The caliph's wealth was so vast, his comfort so absolute, that even the ground beneath his feet was lined in novelty. Shoes became currency of spectacle, a walking proclamation of power. And yet, one wonders if there was an undercurrent of insecurity. Why the need for constant change? Was it vanity, restlessness, the fear of being seen repeating himself? The detail is absurd, but it also humanizes him. Even absolute rulers can be ruled by the small anxieties of appearance. Still, compared to the Pharaoh of Egypt who devised a far stranger solution to one of nature's smallest annoyances, al-Mu'taz's footwear fetish seems almost reasonable. Pharaoh Pepi II and his war on flies. Pharaoh Pepi II of Egypt, who reigned for an astonishingly long time, possibly into his 90s, had a problem familiar to anyone living in a warm climate: flies. But unlike ordinary people who swat them away or light a fire, Pepi had a royal solution. He ordered slaves to smear themselves with honey so that the insects would be drawn to them instead of him. On the surface, it's a grotesque image of decadence, a ruler so insulated from discomfort that he transformed human beings into flypaper. But look deeper, and it reveals something essential about monarchy: the power to offload even the smallest inconvenience onto others. While Pepi reclined in comfort, his attendants endured the sticky misery of buzzing swarms. It also reflects a strange truth about human nature. Even in the greatest courts, surrounded by wealth and luxury, rulers remain obsessed with the petty irritations of daily life. Empires can rise and fall, but the buzzing of a fly can drive a pharaoh mad. Pepe's solution was not efficiency but performance, a daily ritual reminding everyone of his separation from ordinary life. The irony, of course, is that Pepe lived one of the longest reigns in recorded history. Perhaps his war on flies worked. Or perhaps it simply shows that when you treat people as tools, history may remember your comfort, but not their suffering. And yet, Pepe's small obsession pales before the ambition of a later caliph who decided the pyramids themselves must hold treasure and set out to break into them. Caliph al-Ma'mun and the Pyramids. Caliph al-Ma'mun, son of the great Harun al-Rashid, was a man of ambition and curiosity. In Baghdad, he patronized scholars and founded the legendary House of Wisdom. But his thirst for knowledge also carried a streak of treasure-hunting fantasy. When he looked at the Great Pyramid of Giza, he didn't see a tomb. He saw a vault waiting to be cracked open. Convinced the pyramid held hidden riches or arcane knowledge, al-Ma'mun ordered it excavated. Workers dug into the massive limestone blocks, carving a passage where none existed, sweating under the Egyptian Sunday. What they found inside was not piles of gold, but empty chambers, stone corridors, and the eerie silence of antiquity. Disappointed but undeterred, al-Ma'mun declared the discovery a triumph anyway. To admit failure would have been unthinkable. His passage into the pyramid still exists today, a jagged tunnel cut by men chasing a ruler's fantasy. Tourists walk through it, often unaware that they're tracing the footsteps of a caliph's curiosity. The irony is striking. In his quest for treasure, al-Ma'mun inadvertently preserved the pyramid's mystery for the modern world. His failed expedition left us with questions instead of answers, which, in a way, is more valuable than any gold. So we see the paradox again. Rulers chasing illusions, leaving behind legacies of strangeness rather than practicality. And as we leave Egypt's stone corridors, our story takes us eastward, to an emperor who sought immortality not in treasure, but in something far more dangerous, Mercury. Emperor Qin Shi Huang and the Mercury of Immortality. China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, was obsessed with eternity. He unified warring states, standardized currency, ordered the construction of roads, canals, and of course, the Great Wall. Yet none of those achievements mattered to him as much as the one thing he could not command, his own mortality. Determined to live forever, he sought the elixirs of immortality from alchemists who promised secrets hidden in metals and minerals. Among their offerings was mercury. To Qin, mercury was no poison but a potion. He ingested it, believing it would extend his life. Ironically, what he thought would make him eternal may have hastened his decline. His health faltered, paranoia deepened, and he spent his final years chasing phantom remedies across his empire. In death, his fear of impermanence was immortalized in stone. The terracotta army, thousands of clay soldiers buried with him, as though sheer numbers could guard him against the void. The cruel twist is that Qin Shi Huang did achieve immortality, but not the kind he sought. His name endures precisely because of his failure. History remembers him as the emperor who sought eternal life by swallowing death disguised as medicine. And while Qin's immortality quest ended in tragic irony, another ruler of China, the only woman to ever declare herself emperor, found her legacy not in potions, but in spectacle. Among her wonders was a mechanical bird that seemed alive, designed to astonish her guests. Empress Wu Zetian and the Singing Automaton. Empress Wu Zetian stands apart in Chinese history as the only woman to rule outright as emperor. Her reign was marked by ruthless politics, yes, but also by spectacle and innovation. Among her many fascinations was a mechanical marvel, an artificial bird that could sing. Accounts describe her palace filled with wonders, but none captured the imagination like this device. Imagine courtiers gathered in a hall, tense and watchful, when suddenly a bird made of bronze or gilded wood fluttered its wings and sang as though alive. The mechanical wonder wasn't just entertainment, it was politics. By surrounding herself with marvels that seemed magical, Wu projected authority beyond human reach. For a woman in a patriarchal system, this mattered. Her legitimacy was always contested, and she needed tools to keep challengers in awe. A singing automaton did the trick. It blurred the line between natural and supernatural, between invention and illusion. What makes this even more striking is how modern it feels. In an era when machines were crude, Wu celebrated technology as theatre. She was centuries ahead of her time in understanding how spectacle could secure power. And in that sense, her mechanical bird wasn't just a curiosity, it was a metaphor for her rule. Something artificial perhaps, but no less real in its effect. And while Wu charmed with her automaton, another Chinese emperor's love ran in a different direction, not toward invention, but toward horses. So much so that he hired musicians to perform concerts for them. Emperor Xuanzong and his horses' concerts. During the Tang dynasty, Emperor Xuanzong of China presided over one of the most culturally dazzling courts in history. Poetry, painting, and music flourished. Yet even amid this golden age, his most peculiar indulgence involved his horses. Not content with feeding or grooming them, Xuanzong commanded musicians to play for them. Yes, the imperial stables became concert halls. Horses, bedecked with silks, listened to flutes and drums, as though they too were courtiers deserving of performance. Some chroniclers claim Xuanzong believed the music soothed the animals, making them stronger and more loyal. Others suggest it was simply an extension of his refined tastes. If humans enjoyed symphonies, why shouldn't horses? The image is both ridiculous and oddly touching. An emperor, master of armies, directing symphonies for animals who likely cared more about oats than orchestras. Courtiers, no doubt, applauded the idea, unwilling to suggest that the horses might not appreciate the finer points of composition. But behind the absurdity lies something revealing. Xuanzong's reign was defined by excess, cultural brilliance, and, eventually, decline. The concerts for horses symbolized the tipping point, when prosperity becomes indulgence, when refinement turns into frivolity. Music for horses may have seemed like art, but it also foreshadowed the disconnect between ruler and ruled that would weaken his dynasty. Still, compared to the Emperor of India who planted trees for weary travelers and outlawed cruelty in his kingdom, Xuanzong's horse concerts seem almost selfish. For Ashoka the Great, the obsession was not with performance, but with morality itself. Ashoka the Great and his moral highways. Ashoka of India began as a conqueror. Early in his reign, he waged brutal wars, expanding the Mauryan Empire to vast stretches of the subcontinent. But, after witnessing the devastation he had caused, he changed course dramatically, turning to Buddhism and reshaping his empire around compassion and morality. Among his many reforms was a surprisingly practical one: planting trees along roads. These weren't symbolic plantings either. They were carefully chosen for shade, meant to shelter travelers and animals under the blistering Indian Sunday. Ashoka also had wells dug and rest houses built, transforming roads into spaces of care rather than hardship. In an empire of enormous distances, these moral highways served as both infrastructure and statement. The ruler cared about even the humblest traveler. But Ashoka went further. He banned animal sacrifice in his empire, encouraged vegetarianism, and established rules for humane treatment of both people and creatures. This was not just politics, it was philosophy enforced at scale. He carved his moral vision into stone edicts, placed across the land so all could see. The irony, of course, is that Ashoka is remembered as both a ruthless conqueror and a saintly reformer. The same man who'd once piled up battlefields with corpses later wept over ants and planted trees for strangers. Which version was the real Ashoka? Perhaps both. His reign shows how even emperors are capable of moral whiplash. But if Ashoka turned to shade trees and morality, Japan's Emperor Hirohito sought peace of mind in something very different. The endless cataloguing of sea creatures. Emperor Hirohito and his jellyfish. Most rulers spend their lives tangled in politics, but Emperor Hirohito of Japan found himself tangled quite literally in jellyfish. His fascination with marine biology became an obsession so consuming that he personally identified and named thousands of species, with a particular fondness for the gelatinous drifters of the sea. Picture it, the Emperor of Japan, a figurehead for an entire nation, hunched over jars of seawater, peering through magnifying lenses at pulsing, transparent bodies. His diaries and scientific papers detail countless observations of marine organisms. He wasn't dabbling. He was genuinely scholarly, publishing works that earned him respect among biologists worldwide. This hobby served as an odd counterpoint to the turbulence of his reign. While Japan grappled with war, reconstruction, and modernization, Hirohito found solace in the quiet mystery of marine life. Some saw it as escapism, others as a way of grounding himself in something pure and apolitical. The paradox is striking. A man who represented the weight of empire chose to immerse himself in creatures almost weightless. He turned from the steel of politics to the translucence of jellyfish. Perhaps it was his way of reminding himself or forgetting that power and permanence are illusions. And yet Hirohito's thousands of jellyfish look almost small compared to another emperor's project, a bronze Buddha so massive it nearly bankrupted his nation. Emperor Shomu and the giant Buddha. In 8th century Japan, Emperor Shomu envisioned a monument so vast it would embody both devotion and power. His order, to cast a giant bronze Buddha unlike anything the empire had seen. The resulting statue, housed in the Todaiji Temple in Nara, rose to staggering height, shimmering with gilded detail, a figure meant to awe both worshippers and rivals. The cost, however, was astronomical. Resources were diverted, labor conscripted, and the empire's coffers strained. The project nearly bankrupted Japan. Yet Shomu pressed forward, convinced that the Buddha's presence would bring spiritual protection to his realm. When it was completed, the statue was indeed magnificent, a colossal figure radiating calm, towering over all who entered. But its grandeur carried a double edge. For some, it was a beacon of devotion, a statement of unity under Buddhism. For others, it was a monument to extravagance, a ruler's obsession that drained the nation for the sake of spectacle. The irony is timeless. The Buddha, symbol of detachment and simplicity, cast in bronze so heavy it crushed the empire's finances. Shomu's project was both a triumph and a cautionary tale, showing how spiritual ambition can collide with earthly economics. And while Shomu sought meaning in metal and faith, a very different emperor in India found companionship in a far less spiritual symbol. A pet elephant trained to bow like a gentleman at court. Akbar the Great and his courteous elephant. Akbar the Great of India was known for his military genius, his religious tolerance, and his vast empire. But beyond all the grand achievements, he also had a peculiar fondness for animals, especially one very polite elephant. Unlike most elephants used in royal processions or warfare, Akbar's favourite was trained to bow like a courtier. Picture the scene. A gathering of nobles, jewelled turbans and embroidered robes glittering in the sunlight, and then in lumbers an elephant, massive and majestic, lowering itself in a perfect bow as though acknowledging the emperor's authority. It was absurd, yes, but also brilliant theatre. The elephant wasn't just an animal. It was a walking symbol of Akbar's control over nature itself. To bend such a colossal creature into an act of etiquette was to remind everyone that the emperor's reach extended beyond humans into the natural world. For Akbar, this wasn't mere novelty. His court was full of staged rituals, each one reinforcing the aura of his power. A bowing elephant fit perfectly into this narrative. While courtiers bowed from duty or fear, the elephant bowed from training, yet the symbolism was the same. All creation bent to Akbar. And there's something strangely endearing about it too. A man who governed millions still found joy in a giant animal offering a polite nod. But if Akbar's eccentricity was charming, another Japanese emperor's obsession was more pungent. He believed garlic made him invincible. Emperor Go-Daigo and his garlic cure. In 14th century Japan, Emperor Go-Daigo faced turbulent times. His reign was marked by rebellions, shifting loyalties, and endless struggles for survival. To fortify himself, he turned not to armies or fortresses, but to a more humble defense: garlic. He believed eating raw garlic would make him invincible. It was a simple ritual with cosmic expectations. Where generals plotted strategies and monks prayed for divine protection, the emperor munched cloves of garlic, confident that its pungent power shielded him from harm. The court must have endured the constant aroma, half amused, half resigned, as their sovereign insisted his strength came not from divine right, but from his diet. Garlic has long been credited with medicinal properties, but Go-Daigo elevated it to a talisman of survival. To him, cloves were more potent than armor, more reliable than alliances. The irony is sharp. The emperor who tried to reshape Japan's politics was also reshaping his meals into superstition. It's easy to laugh, but isn't this simply another version of what rulers have always done? Invest belief in rituals, charms, or symbols that seem absurd in hindsight, but gave them comfort in their uncertainty. Garlic may not have made him invincible, but perhaps it gave him the courage to face battles that might otherwise have broken him. Still, compared to Go-Daigo's garlic cure, the eccentricity of another emperor looks almost regal. A Mughal monarch who paraded into battle with a lion as his companion, Emperor Jahangir and his pet lion. In the Mughal Empire, Emperor Jahangir stood out as a lover of nature, animals, and spectacle. His fascination went beyond gardens and paintings. He kept a pet lion that often marched alongside his soldiers. To see a lion in India was already rare. To see one walking in procession beside the emperor was unforgettable. The lion was more than a pet. It was a symbol. Jahangir cast himself as the lion's equal, perhaps even its master. In a culture where lions represented courage, power, and divine kingship, having one by his side turned every public appearance into a living allegory. The emperor wasn't just human, he was leonine. Accounts describe Jahangir doting on the lion, feeding it, training it, and presenting it as though it were part of his royal family. To foreign emissaries, it must have been bewildering. Negotiations conducted under the watchful eyes of a predator pacing at the emperor's feet. The image is both terrifying and absurd. Soldiers armed with spears and muskets could be disciplined, but a lion is unpredictable. It could strike without warning. Yet Jahangir embraced the risk, confident that the lion's presence enhanced his mystique. Power, after all, is partly about fear. And while Jahangir found vitality in his lion, another Chinese emperor preferred something more delicate, pearls dissolved in vinegar, consumed as though they were medicine. Emperor Gaozong and the vinegar pearls. In the glittering halls of the Chinese court, luxury was not simply displayed, it was consumed. Emperor Gaozong of the Tang dynasty, took this to its most literal extreme by insisting on drinking pearls dissolved in vinegar. To him, pearls weren't ornaments for crowns or jewelry. They were health supplements, believed to strengthen vitality and preserve longevity. The process was theatrical. Servants would crush pearls, pour vinegar over the powder, and watch the gem dissolve into a cloudy liquid. What most would call treasure, Gaozong called a beverage. Courtiers dutifully admired his sophistication, though surely some wondered whether the emperor was drinking wealth out of boredom or conviction. In truth, pearls were long believed in Chinese medicine to have restorative properties, but Gaozong's practice elevated them from treatment to spectacle. Each cup was not just a tonic, it was a declaration that the empire's riches could be swallowed without hesitation. If others wore pearls as status symbols, Gaozong absorbed them into his body. It is both absurd and oddly symbolic. Power, at its height, consumes. Wealth becomes nourishment, jewels become health potions, and the emperor becomes the embodiment of excess. Gaozong's vinegar pearls were less about medicine and more about a monarch reminding everyone that the earth's treasures existed for his digestion. And yet, while Gaozong drank pearls, another ruler, on a different continent, commanded a far harsher ritual, one that plunged his kingdom into famine, all in the name of grief. King Shaka Zulu and the Year of No Crops. When Shaka Zulu's mother died, grief struck him with such force that he demanded his entire kingdom share in his mourning. His decree was devastating. No crops were to be planted for a year. The land was left barren, fields untended, harvests abandoned. The result was inevitable. Famine spread across the Zulu kingdom. What makes this story so haunting is not just the extremity of the command, but the way it weaponized grief. For Shaka, mourning could not be private, it had to become a national ritual of suffering. His sorrow was imposed as law, forcing thousands into hardship. It was more than mourning, though. It was power dramatized. By demanding such obedience, Shaka demonstrated that his will reached deeper than politics or war. He could command not just armies, but the very rhythms of life, planting, eating, surviving. The decree revealed both his dominance and his instability. Ironically, Shaka is remembered as a brilliant strategist and nation builder, yet this episode shows the fragility beneath the legend. Grief unraveled his judgment, turning leadership into cruelty cloaked as devotion. His attempt to eternalize his mother's memory left scars across the land. And if Shaka's extravagance of grief destabilized his people, another king, far away in Mali, destabilized entire economies not through destruction, but through an almost reckless generosity with gold. Mansa Musa and the Flood of Gold. Mansa Musa of Mali is often called the richest man in history, and for good reason. His empire sat atop vast reserves of gold, and when he made his famous pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century, he gave so much of it away that he accidentally triggered economic chaos. Along the route, Musa distributed gold to the poor, funded mosques, and showered rulers with gifts. In Cairo, his generosity was so overwhelming that it devalued the metal itself. Prices skyrocketed, economies wobbled, and the aftershocks of his largesse lasted for years. Imagine giving away so much wealth that entire regions suffered inflation. Charity turned into catastrophe. Yet for Musa, it was both devotion and declaration. His pilgrimage was a religious duty, but also a statement of Mali's power and wealth. Every handful of gold he offered was a reminder that his empire was not only prosperous, but dominant in the global stage. The paradox is irresistible. Musa's generosity both elevated his legend and destabilized those who benefited from it. He became immortalized not for hoarding his wealth, but for scattering it so recklessly that the world still talks about it centuries later. And while Musa's generosity shaped economies, another African ruler turned his fascination toward modern technology, importing the empire's first electric chair, only to realize his palace didn't even have electricity. King Menelik II and the useless electric chair. In the late 19th century, Ethiopia's King Menelik II was determined to modernize his kingdom. He imported railways, telegraphs, and even electric light, or at least he tried to. Among his most curious purchases was an American-made electric chair. It was meant to symbolize Ethiopia's leap into the modern age, a piece of cutting-edge technology straight from the West. There was, however, one small problem. His palace didn't have electricity. The electric chair arrived, gleaming and ominous. But it was completely useless. No wires, no current, no sparks. Just a heavy wooden throne with metal fittings that mystified his courtiers. The story goes that instead of discarding it, Menelik repurposed the contraption as a regular chair, possibly even a royal seat of honor. What was once a tool of death became, in Ethiopia, a piece of everyday furniture. The tale is absurd, but also revealing. Menelik's ambition to modernize often outpaced the infrastructure around him. The chair became a symbol not of power or punishment, but of irony, a reminder that technology without context is little more than theater. And yet, this anecdote doesn't diminish Menelik's achievements. He successfully resisted European colonization, defeated Italian forces at the Battle of Adwa, and secured Ethiopia's independence. The electric chair story endures, however, because it captures the humor of history. Even great leaders can be undone by misplaced gadgets. If Menelik's eccentricity was technological, another queen's obsession was far darker. In Madagascar, Ranavalona I turned loyalty tests into rituals of poison. Queen Ranavalona I and the Poison Trials. Few monarchs inspired as much fear as Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar. Her reign in the 19th century was marked by paranoia, isolationism, and ruthless authority. Among her most unsettling practices were loyalty trials involving poison. Courtiers and subjects suspected of betrayal or disobedience were forced to drink toxic concoctions. Survival was taken as proof of innocence. Death was seen as divine judgment. To outsiders, this seemed barbaric. To Ranavalona, it was justice wrapped in ritual. She believed the gods themselves decided guilt or innocence, with poison serving as the instrument of fate. In practice, it was a terrifying tool of control. No one could feel secure. Allegiance was measured not by words, but by one's ability to survive the queen's chosen ordeal. These poison trials cemented her reputation as both a feared ruler and a woman unafraid to enforce obedience at any cost. Yet, ironically, they also revealed her insecurity. Ranavalona faced constant threats to her rule, both from within Madagascar and from European powers outside it. Her poison trials were not just about punishing traitors, they were about projecting invincibility, convincing everyone that the Queen's authority flowed directly from the divine. The cruelty of these rituals cast a long shadow, but they also left her reign legendary in its own way. Few rulers embodied the paradox of monarchy, both absolute strength and deep fragility, as starkly as Ranavalona. And while Ranavalona demanded loyalty through fear, another West African king sought loyalty by the opposite approach, listening. Every day, King Tenkamenen of Ghana invited his subjects to bring their grievances to him personally. King Tenkamenen and his daily audiences. In the 11th century, King Tenkamenen of Ghana built his rule not on fear, but on accessibility. While many monarchs hid behind palaces and courtiers, Tenkamenen made it a ritual to hear his people's grievances directly every single day. Subjects lined up to present disputes, complaints, and petitions, and the king listened. The practice was radical. Most rulers elevated themselves above the masses, filtering requests through layers of bureaucracy. Tenkamenen broke that barrier. By opening himself to daily audiences, he turned governance into a dialogue, however limited. It was a spectacle of justice as much as it was a system of rule. To his people, the ritual offered reassurance. They could speak to the king himself, bypassing corruption and favoritism. To foreign observers, it was astonishing. They saw an African monarch who not only commanded wealth from trade in gold and salt, but also maintained legitimacy through accessibility. The irony is that while Tenkamenen's method seems enlightened, it was also performance. The daily audiences reminded subjects of his authority even as they offered them redress. Justice was not separate from monarchy. It was staged by it. Still, in contrast to queens who tested loyalty with poison or rulers who squandered fortunes on vanity, Tenkamenen's reign stands out for its balance. His authority rested not only on gold or armies, but on the simple and radical act of listening. But if Tenkamenen found strength in hearing grievances, another Queen Amina of Zaria found hers in the clash of steel, riding into battle herself in full armor. Queen Amina of Zaria and her battles. In the 16th century, Queen Amina of Zaria, in present-day Nigeria, shattered expectations of what it meant to rule. Unlike monarchs who led from thrones or council halls, Amina led from horseback, clad in armor, spear in hand, riding at the front of her army. She wasn't content to be a symbolic figurehead. She was a warrior queen in the most literal sense. Her campaigns extended Zaria's territory across Hausaland, building a reputation so formidable that neighboring states both feared and respected her. Oral histories describe her as fierce and unyielding, her presence on the battlefield both inspirational to her soldiers and terrifying to her enemies. Amina didn't just command strategy, she embodied it, proving her leadership in the dust and blood of open combat. Yet she was also a builder. Beyond conquest, she ordered the construction of fortified walls around cities, structures that became so iconic they were remembered as Amina's Walls. These defenses protected her people long after her death, standing as physical reminders of her reign. Her story has the texture of legend, part history, part folklore. Was she as invincible as the tales claim? Did she really lead every charge? The truth is blurred, but the myth itself is telling. In a world where women were often excluded from power, Amina's legend became a living contradiction, both queen and warrior, both builder and destroyer. And while Amina's strength was measured in walls and wars, another African king was remembered for something quite different, his sheer physical size, so enormous that doors themselves were said to be too narrow for him. King Lobengula and the Doorways. King Lobengula of Zimbabwe, the last ruler of the Ndebele kingdom, was remembered as a man of towering presence. His wealth and authority made him a formidable figure. But what captivated stories about him was his size. He was said to be so large that ordinary doorways could not contain him. Whether exaggerated or true, the image of Lobengula squeezing through narrow spaces became part of his legend. Size in monarchy is always metaphorical as much as physical. A large ruler is interpreted as a large presence, bigger than life, larger than fate. Lobengula's girth became a symbol of power, abundance, and perhaps indulgence. Visitors wrote about it with fascination, sometimes admiration, sometimes mockery. His subjects, however, likely saw it as a natural extension of royal grandeur. Yet, his reign was far from comic. Lobengula faced the encroaching ambitions of European colonial powers, particularly the British South Africa Company. His kingdom, rich in cattle and land, became a target. While his physical presence loomed large, the geopolitical tides around him grew larger still. In the end, it wasn't doorways but colonial forces that proved too narrow for his kingdom to pass through. Still, the image of the king who dwarfed architecture lingers. It reminds us how physical traits, whether exaggerated or real, become wrapped into legend, transforming individuals into symbols. And while Lobengula's body became a legend of size, another African king reshaped religion itself, daring to cast aside gods that had stood for centuries in favor of one blazing disk in the sky, Pharaoh Akhenaten and the Aten. In 14th century BCE Egypt, Pharaoh Akhenaten performed one of the boldest experiments in religious history. He abandoned the pantheon of traditional gods Ra, Osiris, Isis, Amun, and countless others, and declared that only one deity mattered, Aten, the sun disk. This was not a subtle reform. Temples to the old gods were closed, priests were stripped of power, and the entire machinery of Egyptian religion was redirected toward worship of the Aten. Akhenaten even built a new capital city, Akhetaten, dedicated to the Sunday. The move was radical, bordering on reckless. Egyptian religion had been stable for centuries, woven into every ritual, every harvest, every afterlife hope. By overturning it, Akhenaten destabilized not just theology but society itself. Ordinary Egyptians suddenly found their gods outlawed, their prayers silenced. Why did he do it? Some suggest genuine belief, a conviction that Aten was the one true god. Others argue it was a political maneuver, a way to break the priesthood's power and centralize authority in the pharaoh's hands. Either way, the result was chaos. After Akhenaten's death, the old gods were restored with fervor, and his experiment was erased so thoroughly that later Egyptians called him the heretic king. And yet, history remembers him, precisely because of this failure. His devotion to the Aten left behind art unlike anything else in Egyptian history, elongated figures, intimate family portraits, all bathed in rays of the sun disk. In trying to erase the gods, Akhenaten inadvertently created a style that made him unforgettable. But if Akhenaten reshaped religion itself, another African king preferred a softer tool of diplomacy. The simple gift of cow's gifts he sometimes awkwardly reclaimed. King Moshushu, I and his borrowed gifts. In the 19th century, King Moshushu I of Lesotho carved out a mountain kingdom defined by resilience and clever diplomacy. Unlike rulers who relied solely on war or intimidation, Moshushu wielded generosity as a tool. He often sent cows as gifts of peace to neighboring chiefs, a gesture meant to smooth relations and avoid conflict. In a region where cattle were currency, wealth, and prestige rolled into one, such offerings carried enormous weight. But Moshushu's diplomacy had a curious twist. Sometimes, he asked for the cows back. Whether from practical need or strategic calculation, he would reclaim his gifts, leaving both laughter and confusion in his wake. Imagine receiving a herd of cattle as a sign of goodwill, only to be politely informed months later that the king would like them returned. This strange habit speaks to the flexibility of Moshushu's statecraft. He was not above contradiction. To him, peace was more valuable than consistency. A gift could be temporary if it served the greater purpose of maintaining alliances. His subjects and neighbors likely found it maddening, but they also respected his ability to hold a fragile kingdom together during a time of enormous pressure from both African rivals and encroaching European colonizers. The borrowed cows remind us that diplomacy is often theater. The gesture mattered more than the permanence. Peace could be bought, even rented, so long as the illusion held. And while Moshushu traded in cattle and compromise, another African queen declared her authority in a far more dramatic way by using a human body as furniture when no throne was offered to her, Queen Nzinga and the human chair. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba in present-day Angola remains one of Africa's most formidable rulers. Diplomat, strategist, and warrior, she is remembered for her defiance against Portuguese colonization. But one story from a tense negotiation captures her audacity better than any battle. When the Portuguese refused to provide her with a throne, Nzinga simply ordered one of her attendants to kneel. She sat on the servant's back as though on a royal chair, facing the Europeans eye to eye. The moment was symbolic and unforgettable. It declared that Nzinga would never be diminished, never accept a lesser position. If no throne was given, she would create her own. The gesture shocked her opponents, but also forced them to treat her as an equal. Power, after all, is not only about weapons or armies, it is about presence. Nzinga's act became legend because it condensed her reign into one image: refusal to bow. She understood that optics mattered as much as politics. Sitting on a human chair was both an insult to her adversaries and a performance of sovereignty. She would not be framed as a supplicant queen. She was a ruler, commanding her own throne even in the absence of one. The story has been told and retold because it captures the paradox of power. Sometimes dominance is displayed not through armies or treasure, but through a single gesture of defiance. But if Nzinga demonstrated her power in one symbolic moment, the kings of Europe we return to next showed their eccentricities not in defiance, but in habits so strange they bordered on parody, starting with a Spanish king who refused to change his clothes for weeks at a time, King Philip V and his weeks-long wardrobe. King Philip V of Spain, who ruled in the early 18th century, developed a reputation not for conquest or reform, but for his extraordinary reluctance to change his clothes. For weeks on end, he would wear the same garments, letting them grow increasingly disheveled. Courtiers were bewildered. A monarch who commanded armies and wealth across continents seemed unable or unwilling to embrace the simplest rituals of hygiene. Some chroniclers suggest this was linked to bouts of melancholy that plagued Philip throughout his reign. Depression was not understood in his time, and what might now be seen as illness was then interpreted as eccentricity or laziness. Others believe he was simply indifferent, detached from the material expectations of court life. The result was surreal. While Versailles dazzled with silks and jewels, Madrid's court endured the sight of their king repeating the same shabby attire day after day. Ambassadors must have struggled to reconcile the grandeur of Spain's empire with the rumpled figure who represented it. And yet, there's an odd humanity in Philip's eccentricity. For once, the king did not care about the endless performance of appearance. Perhaps in his stubborn refusal to change clothes, he revealed his exhaustion with monarchy's constant theatre. The throne demands perpetual spectacle. Philip chose dishevelment instead. Still, his disregard for bathing and wardrobe seems almost mild when compared to another Queen of Spain, Isabella of Castile, who took personal neglect to a level even more legendary. Queen Isabella of Castile and her 2 baths. Queen Isabella of Castile, famed for sponsoring Columbus's voyage and uniting Spain with Ferdinand, carried a reputation that was far less regal when it came to personal habits. Chroniclers claimed she bathed only twice in her entire life. Twice, not in a month, not in a year, but across decades of rule. Her reasoning was wrapped in a mixture of piety and suspicion. In late medieval Europe, bathing was often associated with sin, indulgence, or even illness. To Isabella, abstaining from it was an act of holiness, proof of her devotion and discipline. Cleanliness was measured not in soap and water, but in spiritual purity. The irony is sharp. The woman remembered for expanding Spain's global reach may have carried with her the odour of medieval austerity. Her belief in God not requiring washing became as famous as her political achievements. For courtiers and ambassadors, it must have been both baffling and uncomfortable. Yet, in Isabella's world, such asceticism was a badge of honor rather than shame. Still, her refusal to bathe was not entirely unique. Many Europeans of her time distrusted water, believing it opened the body to disease. But Isabella's example became legendary because of her prominence. A queen who defined an era also embodied its strangest misconceptions about health and holiness. And if Isabella shunned bathing altogether, another royal from Sweden indulged in a different kind of excess, an addiction not to neglect but to stimulation, gulping down coffee with reckless devotion, King Charles XII and his 40 cups. Sweden's King Charles XII was a man of action, known for his military campaigns that carried him across Europe. But beyond the battlefield, he carried another, quieter obsession: coffee. He was said to drink as many as 40 cups in a single day. This was not casual sipping. Coffee was still a relatively exotic drink in Europe at the time, associated with energy, stimulation, and sometimes suspicion. For Charles, it became fuel, a way to keep his body alert and his mind racing. Some claimed he consumed it by the pot rather than the cup, his hands trembling but his will unshaken. The court around him must have buzzed with both admiration and unease. A king pacing through war councils with nerves charged by gallons of caffeine is a peculiar image. Did his coffee habit sharpen his focus, or did it fray his judgment? Historians debate whether the stories were exaggerated, but the legend persists because it fits the restless energy of his reign. And yet, the habit mirrors the contradictions of monarchy itself. Rulers who demand endless endurance turn to rituals that are both sustaining and self-destructive. For Charles XII, the empire's burdens were carried on a jittery tide of caffeine. But if Charles turned coffee into compulsion, another king found a darker outlet for stress, fashioning wax dolls of his enemies and beating them in effigy: King Ferdinand I and his wax enemies. King Ferdinand I of Naples took a creative approach to hostility. Instead of confronting his enemies on the battlefield or in council, he had wax statues made of them. These effigies were not for decoration. He used them as targets for his rage, beating and tormenting the wax figures as though they were the real thing. To his courtiers, it must have been both unsettling and oddly comical. The king, ruler of a real kingdom, striking at candles shaped like rivals. Perhaps it was a form of stress relief, a private theatre of power where he always won. No wax doll could talk back or resist. But beneath the absurdity lay something darker. Effigies have always carried symbolic weight, blurring the line between representation and reality. To harm an image of someone is, in a way, to harm them in spirit. For Ferdinand, smashing wax enemies was more than play, it was ritualized dominance. The irony is rich. A ruler commanding real armies still needed a miniature stage to act out his grudges. It suggests that even kings, surrounded by grandeur, sometimes crave childish outlets for frustration. And while Ferdinand vented his rage on wax, another monarch across the sea expressed his impulses more unpredictably through the sudden slap of a hand, even at the expense of diplomatic etiquette: King Christian VII and the random slaps. Court life in 18th century Denmark must have been an exercise in vigilance. Under King Christian VII, no one was safe from sudden royal whim, particularly his habit of slapping people without warning. Ambassadors, courtiers, even high-ranking guests could find themselves struck by their monarch mid-conversation, left stunned while the court tried to pretend it hadn't just happened. Historians now often interpret Christian's behavior as part of his documented mental illness, but for his contemporaries, it was simply unnerving. Imagine traveling from a foreign land, entering Copenhagen's ornate palace, presenting gifts with flowery speeches, only to be met with a royal backhand. Diplomacy, rewritten as farce. Yet his unpredictability went further. Christian was known for erratic behavior, running through the streets at night, mocking court protocol, and indulging in bizarre theatrics. His random slaps became symbolic of his entire reign. Authority unmoored from order. A kingdom forced to bend to the chaos of one man's impulses. The irony is that while Christian's personal behavior seemed ridiculous, it reflected the fragility of monarchy itself. When power is concentrated in a single person, stability depends entirely on that person's moods. And in Denmark, moods often translated into slaps. If Christian's reign turned diplomacy into slapstick, Russia's infamous Ivan the Terrible elevated unpredictability to an art form, and he used bears to do it. Ivan the Terrible and his bears in the streets. Moscow under Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was not merely a city of palaces and churches, it was also, at times, a city of bears. The Tsar had a fondness for releasing the great beasts into the streets, allowing them to roam as both entertainment and intimidation. For common people, the sight was terrifying. Bears were not circus animals but powerful predators, and their presence turned ordinary markets and alleys into danger zones. Yet for Ivan, that was the point. To unleash bears was to remind everyone that fear itself was his companion, as unpredictable and uncontrollable as the animals he let loose. Ivan's use of bears became part of his larger reputation, a ruler who ruled through terror, mixing spectacle with cruelty. It was governance as theatre, and the city itself became his stage. Citizens learned quickly that life under Ivan was not just about taxes or laws, it was about surviving his whims. The bears are remembered not just as oddities, but as symbols of his reign. Raw power turned loose, majestic and terrifying, admired from a distance, but feared up close. But if Ivan used bears as instruments of fear, another Queen of England embodied fear in a very different way, carrying pregnancies that never existed. Queen Mary the Phantom Pregnancies. Queen Mary I of England, often remembered as Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants, carried another, more intimate legacy: phantom pregnancies. Several times during her reign, Mary announced she was expecting a child. Her belly swelled, her court celebrated, and England prepared for an heir who would secure the Catholic succession. But each time, no child was born. The psychological toll was immense. Mary longed for motherhood, and her people longed for stability. Each false alarm deepened both her personal despair and her political isolation. Courtiers whispered, enemies mocked, and allies grew cautious. The Queen's body became a theatre of disappointment. Some historians speculate these phantom pregnancies were symptoms of medical conditions, perhaps cysts or hormonal imbalances. Others suggest they were psychosomatic, born of Mary's desperate desire for a child. Whatever the cause, the effect was devastating. A monarch's worth, in her era, was tied to producing heirs. Mary's inability to do so haunted her reign as much as her religious persecutions. The irony is profound. A queen remembered for her iron will was also remembered for the fragility of her body's illusions. Her reign is thus framed not just by fire and faith, but by the quiet, haunting image of hope swelling into nothing. And while Mary's reign was defined by the children she never had, across the Channel a future emperor of France lived in dread of creatures much smaller and furrier: cats. Napoleon and the fear of cats. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who reshaped Europe, who marched armies from Cairo to Moscow, who crowned himself emperor in defiance of the Pope, was terrified of cats. The conqueror of nations, who braved cannon fire and cavalry charges, could not face a purring house pet. Chroniclers record his fear of felines as intense, bordering on irrational. This was more than mild discomfort. Cats, to Napoleon, were sinister. Their silence, their watchful eyes, their ability to appear and vanish unnerved him. It's said that he would recoil in their presence, treating them as though they were agents of some unseen power. For a man obsessed with control, Cats embodied everything he couldn't command. The irony is irresistible. Here was the general who toppled empires, yet a creature smaller than his hat could unravel his composure. His phobia became one of those details that history clings to not because it shaped battles, but because it revealed the fragility beneath the myth. The emperor who demanded the world kneel could not look a cat in the eye. And if Napoleon's fear was absurd, England's Edward VII embraced the opposite indulgence. His eccentricity was not phobia but excess, extending even to the design of his furniture, King Edward VII and the custom chair. Edward VII of England, son of Queen Victoria and king in the early 20th century, was known for his appetite for food, for luxury, and for company. His size became legendary, so much so that even his pleasures required architectural adjustments. Among the strangest was a specially designed chair created to accommodate his frame during his romantic liaisons. The contraption was both practical and symbolic. Practical, because Edward's bulk and health issues made conventional furniture inadequate. Symbolic, because it revealed the extravagance of a monarch who saw no boundary between his appetites and his authority. When you are king, even chairs bend to your will. This detail, whispered in gossip and recorded in memoirs, has survived as one of the more humanizing, if absurd, glimpses into Edward's life. While he projected the image of a dignified monarch, behind closed doors he reigned over a world of indulgence, comfort, and customization. The chair, in its oddity, became a throne of another kind. It captures the paradox of monarchy, grandeur intertwined with triviality, the fate of a nation tied to the quirks of a single body. But while Edward modified his furniture, another king of Spain modified his very sense of time, surrounding himself with clocks, hundreds of them, each ticking a reminder of his obsession. King Philip II and his clocks. Philip II of Spain ruled over one of the largest empires in history. His reign encompassed territories across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. Yet amid all this grandeur, Philip was obsessed with something far more personal: clocks. He collected them relentlessly, reportedly amassing more than 200. The Escorial, his vast palace monastery, echoed with ticking. Every room, every corridor seemed to hold another clock. They ranged from ornate masterpieces to simpler timepieces, each meticulously maintained. To Philip, clocks were more than machines. They were symbols of order, precision, and divine rhythm. This obsession reveals a fascinating contrast. Philip's empire was sprawling and often chaotic rebellions in the Netherlands, endless wars, a collapsing treasury. Yet within his walls, he sought mastery over time itself, as though owning enough clocks could impose order on the disorder of empire. The irony is poignant. A ruler who commanded oceans and continents was, in the end, still bound by the same ticking seconds as everyone else. Perhaps his clocks comforted him, reminders that even if his empire wavered, time itself marched with perfect regularity. Or perhaps the cacophony of chimes only deepened his anxiety, every hour striking like another problem unresolved. Still, if Philip found solace in clocks, England's Henry VI found discomfort in combat. His eccentricity was not collecting or hoarding, but forbidding he tried to stop knights from jousting at all. King Henry VI and the ban on jousting. In a world where knights sharpened their lances and nobles measured their honour in shattered shields, King Henry VI of England decided he'd had enough of jousting. He wasn't just indifferent to the sport, he despised it, so much so that he banned his knights from practising it altogether. This was no small decree. Jousting wasn't merely entertainment, it was a central ritual of medieval aristocracy. It trained warriors for battle, entertained crowds, and reinforced the ideals of chivalry. To Henry, however, it was a pointless display of violence. He saw no glory in charging at one another with lances, no honour in broken bones, no wisdom in risking lives for spectacle. The ban reflected Henry's personality. Gentle, scholarly, almost monk-like. He preferred piety to pageantry, books to blood sport. Unfortunately for him, England at the time didn't want a philosopher king, it wanted a warrior. His distaste for martial displays weakened his standing among nobles, who saw his ban not as moral strength, but as weakness. The irony is profound. In trying to civilize his court, Henry alienated the very knights who upheld it. His reign, overshadowed by mental instability and the Wars of the Roses, suggests that banning jousts did little to prevent violence. Instead of lances in tournaments, England got swords in civil war. And if Henry's aversion was to fighting for sport, Prussia's Frederick William I indulged in another kind of obsession, building an army of soldiers so tall they looked more like a royal collection than a regiment. Frederick William I and the Giants. In 18th century Prussia, King Frederick William I built an army unlike any other. While most rulers sought disciplined troops or strategic innovation, he obsessed over height. His so-called Potsdam Giants were soldiers chosen solely for their extraordinary stature, some well over 7 feet tall. Recruitment became an odd ritual. Tall men were sought across Europe, purchased, bribed, or even kidnapped to join the regiment. Some were given lavish rewards, others coerced, all united by one simple qualification, being tall enough to please the king. The regiment was more spectacle than strategy. These towering soldiers rarely saw battle. Instead, they paraded before the king, a living collection of human curiosities. Frederick William delighted in marching them, painting their portraits, and showing them off to foreign guests. To him, they were both soldiers and trophies, symbols of his power to command the very bodies of men. The irony is that Frederick William was otherwise known as the Soldier King, a ruler obsessed with discipline, frugality, and military efficiency. Yet his fixation on the giants revealed a contradictory streak. A ruler who preached practicality, but indulged in the most impractical military vanity project imaginable. Still, compared to England's Queen Anne, whose obsession was not height or discipline, but the endless shuffle of playing cards, Frederick William's eccentricity almost seems strategic. Queen Anne and the endless card games. Queen Anne of England, last of the Stuarts, ruled during a period of political upheaval and war, yet her personal obsession was not governance, but gaming specifically, playing cards. Reports claim she could sit for days at a time, playing hand after hand, unable to stop. This was more than pastime. It was compulsion. Anne's health was poor, her reign burdened with factional disputes, and perhaps cards offered her an escape. But to her courtiers, it was unnerving. Decisions languished. Audiences were delayed. All because the Queen was mid-game. The clatter of shuffled decks echoed more loudly in her chambers than the voices of ministers. In one sense, the obsession was harmless. Cards cost little compared to castles or wars. Yet symbolically, it was damning. A queen who seemed disengaged from pressing matters, immersed instead in repetitive games of chance, embodied the fragility of monarchy at its weakest. The image is poignant. A lonely queen, racked with illness, dealing out cards in endless rhythm, seeking comfort in the shuffle and turn. The throne, after all, is its own kind of gamble, and perhaps Anne's cards reflected her reign better than she knew. But if Anne's fixation was escape through games, Rome's Emperor Commodus sought escape of another kind into fantasy. He dressed as Hercules, entered the arena, and fought gladiators who never stood a chance. Emperor Commodus and his gladiator games. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, could have inherited the image of a philosopher king. Instead, he chose to inherit the costume of Hercules and the title of entertainer. He adored the arena, not as a spectator like the rest of Rome, but as a performer. Commodus dressed in a lion skin, carried a club, and styled himself as the reincarnation of Hercules. Then he stepped into the Colosseum not to watch, but to fight. Or rather, to pretend to fight. His gladiatorial matches were less contests than pageants. The emperor could not lose. His opponents were carefully selected to ensure his victories, whether by weakness, exhaustion, or outright staging. Commodus slew animals and men alike before a crowd forced to cheer. He was not interested in honor, he was interested in applause. To Rome, this was scandalous. An emperor in the arena blurred the sacred line between ruler and performer. Yet, Commodus relished it. The Colosseum became his theater of power, his validation not in the Senate, but in the crowd's roar. He craved recognition not as emperor, but as champion. The irony, of course, is that Hercules was mythic for strength, while Commodus was legendary for delusion. His reign became a cautionary tale of what happens when rulers confuse spectacle with governance. Rome needed leadership. It got an emperor in costume. And if Commodus played Hercules on stage, Spain's Alfonso XIII played a different role altogether, the practical joker, turning his court into a stage of collapsing chairs. King Alfonso XIII and his practical jokes. Alfonso XIII of Spain had a reputation not for wisdom or strategy, but for mischief. Among his favorite pranks was replacing palace furniture with collapsible chairs. Imagine ambassadors, generals, or visiting dignitaries seating themselves with pomp and dignity only to crash to the floor as their chair gave way. The king would laugh, the courtiers would force nervous chuckles, and the victim would brush off their robes in humiliation. It was humor weaponized. In a court where every gesture was steeped in ceremony, Alfonso introduced slapstick. He turned diplomacy into comedy at others' expense. His love of practical jokes didn't stop with furniture. He reportedly delighted in small tricks and surprises that kept courtiers on edge. Why would a king indulge in such antics? Perhaps it was boredom, perhaps insecurity, or perhaps a way to assert dominance. After all, a collapsing chair is more than a prank. It's a reminder that the king controls the stage, and that others exist at his mercy, even in laughter. To his people, Alfonso's antics sometimes appeared frivolous, especially in an era when Spain was struggling with decline and crisis. His sense of humor became a metaphor for his rule, entertaining, unpredictable, but lacking the gravity his nation demanded. And if Alfonso mocked his court with collapsing chairs, Henry IV of France earned mockery of another kind entirely: his legendary avoidance of bathing, which left courtiers fainting at his presence. King Henry IV and the scent of neglect. Henry IV of France, celebrated for his charisma and pragmatism, carried with him a trait far less celebrated: his refusal to bathe. Reports insist he was so reluctant to wash that his odor became overwhelming. Courtiers dreaded his approach, and foreign dignitaries sometimes struggled to endure audiences with him. It was said that people literally fainted in his presence. This was not merely laziness. Henry reportedly claimed bathing made him ill. In his mind, water carried risks, and dirt was safer than soap. This belief was not uncommon in Europe, but Henry took it to extremes. While he was remembered for his charm and accessibility, his personal hygiene was a contradiction. A beloved king with an unbearable smell. The irony is striking. A monarch known as Good King Henry, praised for his earthy manner and ability to connect with common people, was also remembered for driving them away with his odour. His warmth and humanity were undercut by a neglect so profound it became legend. And yet, his smell did not prevent him from leaving a legacy of tolerance and stability. Perhaps it even reinforced his image as down-to-earth a king who was literally of the earth. Still, compared to the Byzantine emperor who lost his nose and replaced it with gold, Henry's eccentricity seems almost modest. Emperor Justinian II and the golden nose. In the turbulent politics of Byzantium, punishments were rarely symbolic. When Emperor Justinian II was overthrown in the late 7th century, his enemies mutilated him by cutting off his nose, a statement that he was unfit to rule. In Byzantine tradition, a disfigured body was believed to disqualify a man from wearing the crown. Justinian, however, refused to accept the verdict. Instead of vanishing into obscurity, he had a prosthetic nose fashioned from gold. The result was both grotesque and regal, a ruler who gleamed where others bled, wearing a literal mask of defiance. Far from retreating, Justinian returned to power, marching back into Constantinople as the emperor with the golden nose. The mutilation meant to end his career instead became part of his legend. The golden nose symbolized resilience, but also stubborn vanity. It turned physical loss into political theatre, reminding both allies and enemies that Justinian would not be erased. Where others saw shame, he fashioned spectacle. And yet, the irony is inescapable. The man who insisted on his divine right to rule needed a piece of metal to maintain the illusion of wholeness. His reign became less about governance than about image, a theme that seems to haunt monarchy in every age. But if Justinian's fear was disfigurement, James I of England carried another, an irrational terror of knives. King James I and the fear of knives. James I of England, the same king who oversaw the translation of the Bible that bears his name, lived under a peculiar dread: knives. He feared them so much that he forbade anyone from coming near him with one. At meals, his servants had to cut his food in advance, removing blades from his sight before he sat at the table. This phobia, while strange, had a context. James lived in an era where assassination by dagger was not uncommon, and monarchs were constant targets of plots. His fear, however, exceeded precaution. It was obsessive, shaping his daily routines and creating a courtly choreography around his anxieties. The irony is vivid. The man who claimed divine authority, who projected the strength of monarchy, trembled at the sight of a knife. His enemies saw weakness, but his courtiers saw ritual meals stripped of blades, dining turned into an exercise in theatrical caution. It also reveals the fragility beneath power. A ruler could command armies and pass laws, yet still be undone by private terrors. In James's case, the throne rested uneasily beside a phobia of cutlery. And while James shrank from knives, another monarch, Queen Margaret of Denmark, embraced a different indulgence altogether, one that smoked through her reign in a haze of tobacco. Queen Margaret of Denmark and the eternal cigarette. Queen Margaret of Denmark, who reigned in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, became instantly recognizable, not just for her regal presence, but for the ever-present cigarette between her fingers. She was rarely seen without one, whether in private moments or at public appearances. Smoking wasn't merely a habit, it was part of her image. The Queen's love of cigarettes became legendary, a quirk that blurred the line between personal vice and public identity. Courtiers and journalists alike remarked on it, noting how inseparable she seemed from the haze of smoke. In an era increasingly critical of tobacco, Margaret's refusal to part with her cigarettes felt almost defiant, a monarch clinging unapologetically to her pleasures. It was, in its way, a modern echo of older eccentricities. Where past rulers indulged in jewels, exotic animals, or bizarre rituals, Margaret indulged in smoke, a fleeting luxury, consumed in puffs, leaving only ashes in memory. Her cigarettes became symbolic of individuality within monarchy, of stubbornness against social change, of the peculiar intimacy that eccentric habits create between rulers and their people. For some Danes, it made her seem human. For others, it seemed reckless, but it certainly made her unforgettable. And if Margaret's reign was cloaked in smoke, Francis Charles VIII met a far stranger fate, undone not by indulgence, but by something as mundane as a low doorway. King Charles VIII and the fatal doorway. Charles VIII of France, remembered for his youthful ambitions and disastrous Italian campaigns, met an end so mundane that it reads like dark comedy. In 1498, while walking through his castle at Amboise, he struck his head on a low doorway. The injury proved fatal. No battlefield drama, no palace intrigue, just a miscalculated step. The story spread across Europe, astonishing those who expected kings to fall in more glorious fashion. Charles had dreamed of making France a Mediterranean power, yet his grand designs collapsed in an instant against the stubbornness of stone architecture. It was the humblest of assassins, a lintel. The irony is that Charles had built his identity around martial ambition. He invaded Italy, seeking conquest and prestige, only to be remembered for tripping into death. His reign became a reminder that no matter how elevated the crown, kings live and die by the same banal accidents as their subjects. The image of France's monarch felled by a doorway lingers because it subverts expectations. Kings are supposed to be untouchable, but Charles's fate shows the fragility of power, undone not by a rival's sword but by architecture. And while Charles VIII died by accident, another emperor of Japan deliberately stepped into history by publishing scientific papers not about politics or war, but about fish. Emperor Akihito and his fish papers. Emperor Akihito of Japan, who reigned until his abdication in 2019, stands out among modern monarchs for his unusual scholarly pursuit. While most rulers left their names in treaties or wars, Akihito published scientific papers on fish. He was a passionate ichthyologist, dedicating decades to the study of gobies, a family of small, unassuming fish. His research wasn't a hobby masquerading as scholarship. He worked with professional biologists, cataloguing species, identifying new ones, and contributing to the field. Scientific journals carried his name not as patron but as author. This fascination offered him a curious form of escape. As emperor, Akihito was bound by ritual and responsibility. But in the world of fish, he was a peer among scientists, another student of nature. The Emperor of Japan, custodian of centuries of tradition, was also a man peering into tanks, scribbling notes on tiny aquatic creatures. The juxtaposition is striking. A man seen as semi-divine by some traditions bent over petri dishes, measuring fins. But it also speaks to the enduring theme of monarchs seeking identity beyond crowns. Where others sought immortality through war or monuments, Akihito found it in gobies. And while Akihito's obsession was rooted in modern science, another emperor of China wielded his power over something far less rational: shoes. Emperor Hongwu and the ban on shoes. The Hongwu Emperor, founder of the Ming dynasty, was a man of immense authority. He rose from humble beginnings as a peasant monk to become ruler of China, reshaping the empire with laws, bureaucracy, and force of will. Yet even with such sweeping control, his attention sometimes fixated on the trivial like footwear. Hongwu reportedly banned shoes with pointed tips. Why? Because he thought they looked ridiculous. To his eye, The exaggerated fashion of narrow curled shoes was foolish and unbecoming of proper subjects, so he outlawed them. It was a decree both absurd and revealing. Fashion, in his empire, wasn't personal expression, it was political order. To wear pointed shoes wasn't just bad taste, it was defiance. By legislating something so small, Hongwu reminded everyone that nothing in his domain, not even shoelaces, was beyond his reach. For the people, the ban must have been baffling. Here was the emperor who commanded armies and rebuilt cities, dictating the shape of their footwear. But such decrees show the mentality of absolute rule. Every detail of life, no matter how trivial, was subject to imperial scrutiny. The irony is timeless. A man who rose from rags to throne ended up policing fashion. And while Hongwu fretted about shoes, another emperor of India adorned his face with something far more extravagant spectacles made of diamonds. Emperor Shah Jahan and the diamond spectacles. Shah Jahan, the Mughal emperor most famous for building the Taj Mahal, had a taste for beauty so refined that even his vision of the world had to be filtered through gems. Among his possessions were a pair of spectacles with lenses cut from diamonds, not glass, not crystal, but diamonds, polished thin enough to see through. Imagine it, a ruler peering at his empire through stones that most people would guard in vaults. For Shah Jahan, the lenses weren't just about luxury. They symbolized clarity, purity, perhaps even divine vision. Diamonds, after all, were seen as embodying perfection and strength. To wear them over one's eyes was to suggest that one's sight itself was extraordinary. But there's a paradox here. Diamonds, however beautiful, are not ideal for seeing. Their refraction distorts vision. The very lenses that were supposed to sharpen his gaze may have warped it instead. It is a fitting metaphor, a ruler so enamored of grandeur that even his perspective was clouded by excess. Still, these spectacles endure as a symbol of his obsession with beauty. The man who built the Taj Mahal as an eternal love letter also adorned his own face with jewels. In both stone and spectacle, Shah Jahan demanded that the world be refracted through luxury. And while Shah Jahan gazed at his empire through diamonds, another emperor of Asia found joy in something far simpler, an icy dessert of milk and rice that prefigured the modern ice cream cone. Kublai Khan and the frozen treats. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, ruler of the Mongol Empire at its height, had an appetite not only for conquest but also for cold, sweet indulgences. He was fond of a dessert made from frozen milk and rice, an early ancestor of what we now call ice cream. In the Mongol court, chefs perfected the art of chilling milk, using mountain ice or salt mixtures, creating a dish both refreshing and novel. For Kublai, it was a symbol of sophistication, blending Mongol tradition with Chinese innovation. His frozen milk desserts became a courtly delicacy, enjoyed amid the opulence of Yuan palaces. To us, ice cream is a simple pleasure. To Kublai, it was a display of empire, a fusion of cultures, technologies, and luxuries made possible only by vast networks of power. It demonstrated that he could command not only armies but also climates, summoning winter into summer bowls. There is irony here. The man who ruled one of the largest land empires in history, whose campaigns shook continents, is remembered not just for battles, but for dessert. His frozen indulgence echoes into history every time we unwrap a cone. And while Kublai Khan sweetened his reign with frozen milk, another emperor, the last of China, clung to something far more childlike: toy trains. Emperor Puyi and the toy trains. Puyi, the last emperor of China, lived a life defined by contradiction. Crowned as a child, deposed as a teenager, and manipulated by foreign powers as an adult, he never truly wielded power. Perhaps that's why he turned to play. Among his strangest and most enduring obsessions were toy trains. Even as a grown man, Puyi delighted in laying tracks, running miniature locomotives, and watching them circle endlessly. Visitors to his court or later residences described the surreal sight. The supposed son of heaven reduced to playing with toys. Some saw it as childish regression, others as tragic escapism. The trains were more than pastime. They reflected Puyi's dislocated life. He was an emperor in title, but not in reality, a man trapped between past grandeur and present irrelevance. The toy trains became symbols of control little worlds he could command, even as the real world slipped away from him. The irony is haunting. A dynasty that had ruled for centuries ended with its last emperor tinkering with miniature engines, watching tiny trains circle tracks while his empire fractured around him. Puyi's obsession was less eccentricity than metaphor, a ruler whose life was reduced to simulation. And if Puyi's toy trains embodied nostalgia and loss, another Asian monarch, King Sejong of Korea, left behind something far greater. An alphabet. Not a toy, not a spectacle, but a system of writing that reshaped a nation's identity. King Sejong and his alphabet. King Sejong of Korea, remembered as the Great, left a legacy unlike any other monarch on this list. He didn't build a palace of wonders, commission armies of statues, or indulge in extravagant quirks. Instead, he gave his people something far more enduring, an alphabet. Before Sejong, literacy in Korea was restricted to the elite who could master Chinese characters, a writing system complex and alien to most ordinary people. Sejong believed this was unjust. He wanted a script that commoners could learn easily, one that matched the sounds of Korean speech. In 1443, he unveiled Hangul, a phonetic alphabet of remarkable simplicity and elegance. Hangul was revolutionary. Its design mirrored the shape of the tongue, lips, and throat when making sounds. It was logical, accessible, and, most importantly, empowering. For the first time, farmers, merchants, and artisans could read and write without years of elite training. Sejong declared it an act of compassion, calling it a way to love the people. Ironically, the aristocracy resisted. They sneered at Hangul as a woman's script and clung to Chinese characters as a mark of superiority. But the people embraced it, and centuries later, Hangul remains one of the most efficient writing systems in the world. Sejong's eccentricity wasn't flamboyance but vision. Where other rulers obsessed over vanity, he obsessed over communication. And while he built literacy, another Japanese ruler built something very different, a path out of power itself, abandoning the throne to live as a monk. Ashikaga, Yoshimitsu, and the monk's throne. In medieval Japan, shoguns and emperors usually clung to authority until death. But Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the shogun of Japan in the late 14th century, made an unusual choice. He pursued a Buddhist life while still wielding power. Yoshimitsu constructed temples, patronized monks, and even attempted to merge the authority of shogunate with Buddhist philosophy. In some accounts, he wished to be recognized as a Buddhist monk while still serving as shogun, blurring the line between spiritual renunciation and political dominance. This contradiction fascinated his contemporaries. How could a man claim to embrace detachment from worldly desires while ruling the most powerful military office in Japan? Yet Yoshimitsu embodied this paradox deliberately. For him, Buddhist ritual was not withdrawal but performance, another means of authority. His temple-building projects, including the dazzling golden pavilion, Kinkakuji, became both acts of devotion and monuments of power. The spectacle was breathtaking, gilded temples reflecting in quiet ponds, symbols of impermanence rendered in gold leaf. Yoshimitsu, claimed spiritual humility, but left behind one of Japan's most enduring icons of luxury. His choice to embrace monastic identity while commanding armies captures the irony of monarchy itself. Rulers can proclaim detachment from the world while bending it entirely to their vision. And while Yoshimitsu blended monkhood with rule, another monarch in Burma pursued holiness through a relic far smaller but no less powerful, a single tooth of the Buddha, King Anarata and the Tooth Relic. In the 11th century, King Anarata of Burma, Myanmar, built his authority not only on military conquest, but on devotion to Buddhism. Among his strangest yet most telling acts was the construction of a grand pagoda to house his most treasured possession, a tooth relic of the Buddha. Relics have always carried power, and in Buddhist tradition, a single tooth of the Enlightened One was more than sacred. It was cosmic authority condensed into bone. Anarata believed that enshrining it would sanctify his rule and elevate his kingdom into the spiritual spotlight of Southeast Asia. The tooth was displayed with ceremony, wrapped in layers of gold, honored by monks, and guarded as fiercely as any jewel. Pilgrims flocked to see it, and in doing so, they reinforced Anarata's political legitimacy. His pagoda wasn't just a shrine, it was propaganda in stone, a statement that his reign was blessed by the very presence of the Buddha. Yet there is irony in this devotion. Anarata's relic may or may not have been genuine. Relic authenticity was always questionable, but its power lay in belief, not in proof. A single tooth, real or fake, could hold together a kingdom's identity. The story of the tooth relic reveals how monarchs used faith not only to console themselves but to anchor their authority. And if Anarata sought spiritual security in a tooth, another emperor in Vietnam sought it in silence, leaving his throne behind to pursue life as a monk. Emperor Trun Nhan Tong and the Monk's Path. In 13th century Vietnam, Emperor Trun Nhan Tong did what few rulers ever dared. He gave up the throne voluntarily. After defeating Mongol invasions and securing his kingdom, he shocked his court by abdicating and retreating into the mountains to live as a monk. His decision wasn't forced by scandal, rebellion, or illness. It was a deliberate rejection of worldly power. Trun Nhan Tong founded what would become the Truk Lam Zen sect of Buddhism, teaching disciples, meditating, and writing poetry. From emperor to ascetic, he embodied the Buddhist principle of impermanence in the most literal way. Where most monarchs clung to crowns until death, he abandoned his willingly, trading palaces for monasteries, silk robes for simple cloth. His retreat carried profound symbolism. A king who had once commanded armies now sought command over himself. For his people, this act of renunciation added to his authority, rather than diminishing it. He was no longer just a political leader, but a spiritual one, remembered as both emperor and bodhisattva. And yet, there's a paradox. Even in his monkhood, his royal identity never fully left him. Disciples still revered him as both sovereign and sage. His attempt to shed power only transformed it into a different, more enduring form. While Trun Nhan Tong abandoned his throne for the quiet of the monastery, another ruler in India turned toward the stars, building instruments so massive that astronomy itself became monumental. Maharaja Jai Singh II and the giant observatories. In 18th century Jaipur, Maharaja Jai Singh II looked up at the heavens and decided ordinary instruments would not suffice. He built observatories the size of palaces, astronomical tools rendered in stone, towering across the landscape. At Jantar Mantar in Jaipur, the instruments still stand, colossal sundials, arcs, and geometric shapes, each carefully calibrated to track celestial movements. These weren't symbolic decorations, they were functional, designed with staggering precision to measure time, predict eclipses, and chart the stars. Jai Singh's obsession with astronomy was part of a broader vision. He believed the cosmos influenced earthly affairs and that by mastering its rhythms, he could strengthen his rule. His observatories fused science, faith, and spectacle. Courtiers and visitors alike were struck by their sheer-scale astronomy made into architecture. The paradox is clear. While Europe was inventing telescopes to bring the heavens closer, Jai Singh expanded instruments outward, building tools so large they rivaled temples. His creations embodied both genius and eccentricity, rooted in the conviction that knowledge must be monumental to be meaningful. Centuries later, the stone giants still cast their shadows, reminders of a ruler who turned curiosity into landmarks. And while Jai Singh built monuments to the skies, another king in Africa turned his attention downward to clocks. Thousands of them, but unlike Jai Singh's instruments, they never ticked. King Farouk and the silenced clocks. King Farouk of Egypt, the last monarch before the 1952 revolution, was a man of extravagant tastes. Among his strangest collections was a vast assortment of clocks, reportedly thousands of them. His palaces overflowed with timepieces of every size and style. Yet there was a twist. He couldn't stand the ticking. Farouk ordered them all stopped. What might have been a symphony of chimes and ticks was instead a graveyard of silenced timepieces. His collection became paradoxical, a monument to time frozen. The king surrounded himself with clocks not to track the hours but to deny them. Why? Perhaps it was anxiety, a refusal to hear the relentless march of time. Perhaps it was vanity, the illusion of mastery over mortality. Or perhaps it was simply another manifestation of Farouk's eccentric personality, indulgent and contradictory. The silent clocks echo as metaphor. A ruler clinging to luxury while Egypt moved restlessly toward revolution. A man who collected reminders of time, yet silenced their voices. His reign ended abruptly, toppled by the very passage of history he tried to mute. And if Farouk's quirk was silencing clocks, Albania's King Zog went the other direction, entirely chain-smoking his way through history at a pace that seemed to defy common sense. King Zog I and his endless cigarettes. Albania's King Zog reigned through intrigue, exile, and endless uncertainty, but his most famous personal statistic is not military or political. It is numerical. The man smoked up to 200 cigarettes a day. 200. That's not a habit, that's a profession. Zog's cigarette consumption became legendary, both in Albania and abroad. Courtiers recalled that he always had one lit, often several burning in ashtrays around him, creating a haze through which the business of monarchy was conducted. Diplomats met him across a smoky table, his gestures punctuated not by swords or scepters, but by the flick of ash. In some ways, the habit reflected his reign. Zog lived in constant tension, ruling a fragile state between the pressures of Italy, Greece, and his own restless nobility. The cigarettes became both shield and prop, a way to keep his hands busy and his nerves occupied. Each puff seemed like a private pause, a momentary assertion of calm in the storm of Balkan politics. The irony is striking. Zog, who survived numerous assassination attempts and navigated endless crises, found his truest danger not in politics, but in paper and smoke. His 200 cigarette today's stand as a symbol of both his endurance and his excess. And while Zog turned his life into a haze of tobacco, another king embraced a different indulgence altogether. Not smoke, but marriage. 70 times over. King Sobhuza II and his 70 wives. Sobhuza II of Swaziland, now Eswatini, holds a record difficult to rival. He had over 70 wives and at least 210 children. His reign, which lasted more than 80 years, is one of the longest in world history. Yet beyond his longevity, it was his massive family that captured the imagination. For Sobhuza, polygamy was not merely personal indulgence, it was politics. Each marriage bound him to a family, a clan, or a region, weaving alliances through matrimony. His family became a living map of his kingdom, tying loyalty together with bloodlines. The logistics were staggering. Ceremonies, dowries, households, and of course, the endless line of children who carried his lineage. His court must have resembled both a royal palace and a small city of relatives. Sobhuza turned kinship into a system of governance. His family was his empire. And yet, there's irony here too. By spreading his legacy so widely, he diluted it. With so many descendants, the uniqueness of royal blood became almost ordinary. A king who sought immortality through children ended up creating an empire of heirs too numerous to count. Still, if Sobhuza's obsession was family, Thailand's King Bhumibol Adulyadej found his solace not in people but in music, composing jazz and playing the saxophone with the devotion of a true artist. King Bhumibol and the jazz saxophone. Thailand's King Bhumibol Adulyadej, revered as a stabilizing figure through decades of political turbulence, had an unusual hobby for a monarch. He composed jazz music. Not stiff marches or ceremonial hymns, but smooth, improvisational jazz played on his saxophone. Bhumibol's love of music was genuine and lifelong. He played clarinet, trumpet, guitar, and piano, but the saxophone was his true voice. He even jammed with greats like Benny Goodman and Stan Getz, bridging the worlds of monarchy and jazz club in surreal moments of cultural crossover. His compositions weren't token efforts, they were serious works, blending Thai melodies with jazz improvisation, earning respect from professional musicians. Radio stations in Thailand occasionally broadcast his pieces, allowing his subjects to hear not just their king's speeches, but his music. In a sense, jazz suited him perfectly. Its improvisational nature mirrored the careful balancing act of his reign. Thailand faced coups, protests, and upheavals, yet Bhumibol improvised, adjusting his role, holding the monarchy together through flexibility and timing. His saxophone became both metaphor and escape. The image endures. A king alone with his instrument, breathing life into notes, letting music drift into palace halls. It humanized him in a way few monarchs manage, showing that power and art can coexist in the same person. And while Bhumibol found his rhythm in jazz, another monarch in Arabia found it in motion, traveling the desert in caravans of tents that transformed the wilderness into a mobile palace. King Abdulaziz and the Palace of Tents. The founder of modern Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, lived in a world of vast deserts, shifting sands, and nomadic traditions. Even after unifying his kingdom and gaining immense wealth, he carried those nomadic instincts with him. When he traveled, he brought not just an entourage, but an entire city of tents, a mobile palace. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of richly woven tents were set up wherever he went. They weren't crude shelters, but opulent halls, furnished with carpets, cushions, and ceremonial spaces. The desert transformed into a temporary Versailles, with courtiers and visitors ushered from one fabric chamber to another. The symbolism was powerful. Abdulaziz fused tradition and modernity. His palatial tents echoed Bedouin roots while projecting the grandeur of a king. To foreign dignitaries, the experience was unforgettable. Luxury laid across sand, authority housed in canvas. But the tents were also practical. In a land where permanence was scarce, mobility was survival. Abdulaziz's mobile palaces allowed him to embody both the old desert ways and the new monarchy he was forging. They became metaphors for Saudi Arabia itself, rooted in tradition, yet moving toward modern power. And while Abdulaziz carried his palaces wherever he went, another African ruler staged a coronation so extravagant that it rivaled Napoleon's with a crown that nearly bankrupted his country. Emperor Bokassa and the Napoleon fantasy. Jean Bedel Bokassa of the Central African Republic crowned himself emperor in 1977, a ceremony so flamboyant it seemed scripted by theatre. Inspired by Napoleon, Bokassa staged the coronation with French-style uniforms, golden eagles, and a crown reportedly costing millions of dollars, money his impoverished nation could scarcely afford. The event was staggering in its excess. He arrived in a golden carriage drawn by horses, draped in velvet and jewels, before placing the crown on his own head, just as Napoleon had done centuries earlier. Foreign dignitaries watched in astonishment, while his people saw a spectacle that felt both absurd and surreal. Bokassa's fantasy of empire revealed the fragile line between grandeur and illusion. He wanted to cast himself as a modern Napoleon, an African emperor who defied colonial legacies by mimicking their most theatrical traditions. But the irony was brutal. His coronation drained the treasury, leaving his country poorer and his people angrier. The ceremony became infamous not for its glory but for its extravagance. Bokassa's reign collapsed only a few years later, and his crown remains a symbol of how rulers sometimes buy immortality in pageantry only to bankrupt themselves in the process. And while Bokassa's downfall was tied to extravagance, another king of Spain found himself in trouble for a much simpler indulgence: an elephant hunt. King Juan Carlos and the elephant apology. In 2012, King Juan Carlos of Spain shocked his people not by scandal in the palace, but by being photographed on an elephant hunting trip in Botswana. At the time, Spain was suffering through a deep economic crisis. Unemployment soared, families struggled, and austerity measures bit hard. Against that backdrop, the image of their monarch standing proudly beside a hunted elephant was unbearable. The backlash was immediate. Spaniards condemned the trip as tone-deaf and grotesquely indulgent. The outrage grew so loud that Juan Carlos did something almost unheard of for a king. He apologized. Standing before cameras, he admitted, "I am very sorry. I made a mistake. It won't happen again." The apology was historic. Monarchs rarely admit fault so directly, yet Juan Carlos's hand was forced by the fury of his people. The scandal marked a turning point in his reign, accelerating public disillusionment with the monarchy. The irony is cutting. Juan Carlos had once been celebrated for guiding Spain from dictatorship to democracy, a symbol of national unity. Yet decades later, he was undone by a photograph of a safari. His apology, though sincere, revealed how fragile royal image can be in the modern age. And if Juan Carlos's misstep came from hunting elephants, Ethiopia's Emperor Haile Selassie travelled with them not in the wild, but as personal pets. Emperor Haile Selassie and the pet lions. Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, a man revered by many as a near-divine figure and central icon of the Rastafari movement, also had an eccentric affection for lions. Not carved lions, not symbols on flags, but actual living lions that accompanied him as pets. In Ethiopia, the lion was not just an animal, but a national emblem. Known as the Lion of Judah, Haile Selassie embodied that image literally. Lions roamed his palace grounds, sometimes even paraded for guests. They weren't hidden away in cages but presented as extensions of his royal identity. To see Selassie with a lion at his side was to see the mythology of Ethiopia walking in flesh. The choice was both symbolic and theatrical. Lions represented strength, majesty, and divine legitimacy. To own them was to claim their qualities. For his followers, the sight reinforced the idea that Selassie was chosen by God. For foreign diplomats, it was unforgettable. a reminder that Ethiopia was not merely another monarchy, but one steeped in biblical grandeur. Yet the lions also carried risk. They were unpredictable, wild even in captivity. To keep them as pets was to court danger, but perhaps that was the point. Selassie projected control over even the most fearsome of beasts. His monarchy was power dramatized in fur and fang. And while Selassie built his image through lions, another king, his contemporary in Thailand, found his joy in sailboats, which he designed and built by hand. King Rama IX and his handmade boats. King Bhumibol Adulyadej of Thailand, also known as Rama IX, was a man of many talents: photographer, composer, inventor. Yet one of his strangest hobbies was building sailboats. Not commissioning them, building them with his own hands. He immersed himself in the craft, shaping wood, rigging sails, and testing designs on the water. These weren't toys, either. They were fully functional vessels, capable of competing in races. In fact, Bhumibol sailed his creations himself, entering regattas and often winning against professional sailors. The image is surreal. A monarch who commanded a nation also kneeling in workshops, covered in sawdust, tinkering with hulls and masts. For him, sailing was both relaxation and challenge, a place where skill mattered more than status. His boats were not just hobbies, but symbols. They reflected his vision of monarchy, hands-on, innovative, tied to both tradition and progress. Where other rulers showcased power in jewels, Bhumibol showcased it in craftsmanship. The irony is that while his subjects revered him as a near-mystical figure, he spent hours engaged in the humblest of labors, bending wood and tying knots. His reign became a blend of divinity and practicality, of king and craftsman. And while Rama IX's quirks leaned toward humility, another royal of modern Britain had a habit that leaned toward the opposite: Prince Philip, who sometimes asked questions so blunt they startled entire nations. Prince Philip and the spear question. Prince Philip, consort of Queen Elizabeth II, was notorious for his unfiltered tongue. Diplomatic etiquette demanded caution, but Philip thrived on bluntness, often leaving his hosts bewildered. One of his most infamous moments came during a visit to Australia, when he asked a group of Aboriginal people if they still threw spears at one another. The comment was meant, perhaps, as humour, but it revealed the cultural gap between a 20th century royal and the people he addressed. To the Aboriginal audience, it was awkward at best, insulting at worst. To Philip, it was another quip in a long line of off-the-cuff remarks that scandalized the press but endeared him to those who appreciated his candor. His bluntness became legendary. Courtiers braced whenever he approached a microphone, never knowing whether he'd charm or offend. He seemed to relish the role of the inappropriate elder statesman, untouchable by scandal because everyone expected it from him. The irony is that his gaffes, which might have ruined another public figure, only reinforced his persona. Prince Philip was the royal who said the unsayable, who punctured formality with reckless honesty. And while Philip's words sometimes caused shock, another French emperor's actions did the same, not in speeches, but in wandering into enemy territory as a tourist and getting himself captured. Napoleon III and the sightseeing capture. Napoleon III, nephew of the great Napoleon Bonaparte, spent much of his reign trying to live up to his family name. He ruled France during a time of rapid modernization, commissioning boulevards, railways, and grand exhibitions. Yet his end came with a moment so absurd it feels more like satire than history. He was captured because he went sightseeing during a war. In 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, Napoleon III found himself at the disastrous Battle of Sedan. French forces were overwhelmed. The Prussians encircled the army, and chaos reigned. Instead of directing strategy or rallying his men, Napoleon was reportedly out inspecting the battlefield, almost like a tourist strolling through ruins. This ill-timed excursion ended with his capture by enemy forces. For the French, the humiliation was immense. The emperor, meant to embody national pride, was taken not in heroic resistance, but in bewildering passivity. He was paraded as a prisoner, his empire collapsing around him. The irony is biting. The nephew of Napoleon the Great, master of battlefields, was undone by wandering like a distracted traveler. His reign ended in exile, his empire replaced, and his legacy remembered more for folly than for grandeur. And while Napoleon III stumbled into captivity by accident, another king met a stranger fate, still encountering his near double in Italy. A man who shared not only his face but his very name, King Umberto I and his double. In 1900, King Umberto I of Italy experienced one of history's strangest coincidences. While dining at a restaurant in Monza, he met the owner, a man who looked exactly like him. The resemblance was uncanny, down to facial features and build. But it didn't stop there. The restaurant owner was also named Umberto. He had been born on the same day as the king. He had married a woman with the same name as the queen. Both men even reportedly wore similar clothing that day. The king and his double were stunned by the parallels, a mirror image playing out in flesh and blood. But the story took a darker turn. On the 29th of July, 1900, the day after their meeting, the restaurant owner was shot dead. Later that same day, King Umberto himself was assassinated by an anarchist. The eerie symmetry of their lives ended in symmetrical deaths. Historians debate how much of this story is embroidered legend, but its persistence reveals something deep about human fascination with doubles. The idea that a king and a commoner could share not only faces but fates suggests that identity itself is fragile, subject to forces beyond rank or power. And while Umberto's doppelganger left history shrouded in coincidence, another emperor left his mark through words claiming he could address every audience in the perfect tongue, including his horse. Emperor Charles V and his languages. Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire ruled a domain so vast it was said the sun never set on it. To govern such diversity, Charles mastered languages with ease, and he famously quipped, "I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse." The line, whether apocryphal or not, captures the multilingual reality of his reign. Charles spoke several tongues fluently, shifting effortlessly between courts, regions, and cultures. His linguistic dexterity wasn't just skill, it was necessity. A ruler of Spain, Austria, Burgundy, and beyond needed to speak to each land in its own voice. The irony of his famous quote lies in the last phrase, "German to his horse." It pokes fun at his empire's complexity, suggesting that some languages were more trouble than they were worth, fit only for commands to animals. It was both a joke and a subtle reflection of his struggles, ruling so many lands that even words seemed inadequate. Yet Charles's multilingualism reinforced his authority. He became a human bridge across cultures, his tongue as powerful as his sword. And while Charles used language to hold his empire together, another English king found his downfall not in words but in food specifically, an overindulgence in eels. King Henry I and the eels. Henry I of England, youngest son of William the Conqueror, was a shrewd and practical king. He reigned for decades, navigating wars, succession crises, and the tangled politics of Norman England. But his end came not on the battlefield or through treachery, but at the dinner table from eating too many eels. The story goes that Henry had a particular fondness for lampreys, a type of eel-like fish considered a delicacy. Despite warnings from his physicians, who cautioned him against overindulgence, Henry continued to feast on them. One banquet too many, and the king fell ill. He died soon after, his appetite outpacing his wisdom. The irony is sharp. A man who had ruled with calculation and discipline was undone by gluttony. His downfall was not plotted in secret chambers, but served on platters in his own hall. The king who secured the crown through cunning strategy lost it to his stomach. This small detail of excess has outlived much of his reign in popular memory. Henry I is remembered less for his legal reforms or administration than for the lampreys that killed him. It's a reminder that sometimes history crowns appetite over achievement. And while Henry's body succumbed to indulgence, another king built his resilience through the opposite, slowly teaching himself to survive poisons by swallowing them in small doses. King Mithridates VI and the poison training. Mithridates VI of Pontus, Rome's fierce rival in the 1st century BCE, was obsessed with survival. Surrounded by enemies and haunted by the ever-present risk of assassination, he devised a grim strategy. He trained his body to resist poison by ingesting it in small amounts. Day after day, he consumed tiny doses, building what he hoped was immunity. Over time, he believed himself invulnerable to poison, the method later called Mithridatism after him. His paranoia turned into ritual, his meals laced with danger, his body a laboratory for survival. The practice may have saved him from countless assassination attempts, but it also became his defining eccentricity. His fear of betrayal was so great that he trusted toxins more than people, finding comfort in the very substances meant to kill him. The great irony came at the end of his life. When facing defeat by Rome, Mithridates tried to kill himself with poison only to find that his body, trained against it, resisted. The man who had turned poison into protection found himself trapped by his own defenses. Mithridates' obsession illustrates the paradox of power. The stronger the ruler, the greater the fear of downfall. He sought immortality and immunity, but discovered that control has limits, even over one's own death. And while Mithridates fortified himself with poison, England's William IV fortified his reputation in crudeness, a king remembered as much for his sailor's tongue as for his crown. King William IV and the sailor's tongue. William IV of England, who reigned in the early 19th century, earned the nickname the Sailor King. Before his ascension, he had spent years in the Royal Navy, rising through the ranks in rough conditions. The sea shaped his manners, and when he eventually wore the crown, he never left behind the vocabulary of a sailor. His speech was peppered with curses and blunt remarks, delivered with the unfiltered candor of a man more accustomed to ship decks than palace halls. Courtiers were shocked, foreign ambassadors often scandalized, but William rarely cared. He swore as freely as he breathed, his language reflecting both authenticity and indifference to royal polish. The people, however, found it oddly endearing. His plain-spoken manner gave him a reputation for honesty, even if it lacked refinement. At a time when monarchy was under scrutiny, William's roughness humanized him. He seemed less like a distant sovereign and more like an old sailor who had stumbled onto the throne. Still, his crude tongue underscored a tension within monarchy itself. The crown demands ceremony, but rulers remain human, shaped by their past. William IV ruled with the voice of the sea, carrying storms into the court with every word. And while William swore like a sailor, another king, Frederick II of Prussia, demanded that his soldiers dress like soldiers at all times, even when tending their gardens. King Frederick II and the Uniform Gardeners. Frederick II of Prussia, often called Frederick the Great, reshaped his kingdom into a disciplined military powerhouse. He was a philosopher, musician, and strategist, yet he was also a man of quirks. Among the strangest was his insistence that his soldiers wear their uniforms at all times, even while gardening. The image is almost comical. Men digging in flower beds, pruning hedges, or tending vegetable patches while dressed in crisp Prussian military attire, boots polished and coats buttoned. For Frederick, uniforms weren't just clothing, they were symbols of order, identity, and the state itself. To appear out of uniform was, in his eyes, to diminish the discipline of his army. This obsession reflected Frederick's worldview. He believed the state was inseparable from the army, and the army inseparable from its image. Even mundane tasks had to reinforce the culture of military precision. A soldier out of uniform was a lapse in the theatre of power. The irony is telling. Frederick himself loved music and philosophy, corresponding with Voltaire and playing the flute in private concerts. Yet while he allowed himself escape through art, he denied his soldiers even the comfort of casual clothes while pulling weeds. His kingdom became a garden itself, one where every flower was trimmed by men dressed for parade. And if Frederick dressed his soldiers for battle in the cabbage patch, another king, Alfonso X of Castile, dressed down God himself, claiming he could have improved the design of the solar system. King Alfonso Death and the Solar System Complaint. Alfonso X of Castile, known as the Wise, was a patron of science, philosophy, and law. He commissioned translations of Arabic texts, fostered astronomy, and encouraged scholarship across his kingdom. Yet with wisdom came arrogance, and one of his most infamous remarks. After studying the Ptolemaic system of the cosmos, Alfonso reportedly declared, "If the Lord Almighty had consulted me before creation, I should have recommended something simpler." The statement is staggering. A medieval monarch sitting in his court, critiquing the architecture of the universe. It was both comic and audacious, the ultimate act of royal ego. To Alfonso, the solar system was not divine perfection, but a flawed design awaiting his editorial improvements. Some historians believe he spoke in jest, others that he was expressing frustration with the complexity of astronomical models. But the quote survived because it captures the spirit of kingship. At its most absurd, the belief that even creation itself might have benefited from royal advice. The irony is delicious. Alfonso, who ruled a turbulent kingdom rife with political strife, thought he could rewrite the heavens. His court may have laughed nervously, unsure whether the king's wit was playful or presumptuous. And if Alfonso critiqued the cosmos, another English king tried to cheat it wearing 2 shirts before his execution in hopes of preventing a cold. King Charles I and the 2 shirts. Charles I of England, facing execution in 1649 after the English Civil War, made one last preparation before stepping onto the scaffold. He wore 2 shirts. Not for armor, not for show, but to keep himself warm. It was January, bitterly cold, and Charles feared that if he shivered, the crowd might mistake his trembling for fear. To preserve his dignity, he layered himself against the weather. The detail is both tragic and absurd. A king stripped of crown and power, reduced to worrying about appearances on the day of his death. Charles's reign had been marked by absolutism, religious disputes, and a war that tore England apart. Yet in his final moments, his concern was not politics but perception. He understood that monarchy was theatre to the end. Even as the axe loomed, he wanted the audience to see composure, not weakness. The image of Charles in 2 shirts lingers because it encapsulates the paradox of kingship. Power may crumble, kingdoms may revolt, but the performance of dignity remains. His last act was not resistance, but stagecraft clothing as symbolism, warmth as armor. And while Charles fought to preserve an image of strength in his final hours, another Swedish king staged an experiment with coffee that outlived both him and the doctors who devised it. King Gustav III and the coffee experiment. King Gustav III of Sweden was a man of enlightened ambitions and theatrical habits, but his most peculiar legacy lies in one of history's strangest experiments. Obsessed with the supposed dangers of coffee, a drink that was spreading rapidly through Europe, Gustav was convinced it was harmful, even deadly. To prove his point, he devised a bizarre trial. 2 prisoners sentenced to death were given a reprieve on one condition: they would each drink large amounts of coffee every day for the rest of their lives. To ensure fairness, Gustav appointed 2 doctors to monitor the experiment. The control group, so to speak, consisted of everyone else who avoided coffee. The king expected the experiment to prove his suspicions and end the drink's popularity. Instead, the results turned into a cosmic joke. Both doctors died before the prisoners did. Gustav himself was assassinated before he could see the outcome. And the prisoners? They lived far longer than anyone anticipated. The supposed poison turned out to be no poison at all. The experiment revealed less about coffee and more about the absurdities of royal obsession. Gustav tried to turn science into theatre, only for fate to turn the stage against him. His earnest attempt at proving coffee dangerous instead became one of the earliest and unintentional endorsements of its safety. And while Gustav's coffee trial dragged on longer than he lived, another emperor across Europe found comfort not in experiments, but in routine. For Franz Joseph of Austria, the strangest habit was simply eating the exact same meal every single day for decades. Emperor Franz Joseph and the eternal boiled beef. Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, who ruled for nearly 70 years, endured assassination attempts, revolutions, wars, and the decline of his empire. Yet through it all, one thing never changed: his dinner. For decades, he ate the same meal every day: boiled beef. It wasn't just a preference. It was routine turned into ritual. No elaborate banquets, no experiments with exotic cuisine, no indulgent spreads to rival Versailles. Just beef, boiled simply, served with vegetables or broth. The monotony was astonishing, particularly for a man who could have commanded the finest chefs in Europe to conjure any dish imaginable. Why boiled beef? Perhaps it was a symbol of his personality. Franz Joseph was famously austere, disciplined, and rigid. His habits reflected his governance: predictable, restrained, even dull. Where others might have sought novelty, he sought stability. Every plate of beef was a small assertion of order in a world he could not fully control. But the irony is rich. Here was a man presiding over one of the most diverse empires in Europe. Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, Croats, and countless others, each with their own culinary traditions, and yet his table reduced that diversity to the blandest of routines. His empire was a feast, but his palate was a prison. The story of Franz Joseph's beef captures the paradox of monarchy at its most human. Even as crowns glittered and empires shifted, some rulers clung to comforts so small they bordered on absurd. And so the Habsburg Emperor, master of half of Europe, is remembered not only for his wars and decrees, but for eating the same meal until the end of his life, a reminder that even the greatest rulers can become prisoners of their own routines.